Thank you so much for joining us for day 2. We are going to just quickly review the agenda for the day. So we'll start with 3 kind of in-depth case studies. We'll talk about Cape Town, a series of case studies from resilient urban centers, and then some urban case studies from the United States. We'll have a coffee break, and then we'll go into a deep dive on how to conduct ROI evaluations for nature-based solutions and sort of the considerations that you would need to keep in mind in order to do that. We'll also have 30 minutes of office hours like we did yesterday. We'll have a lunch break, and then in the afternoon, we'll come back for the clinic sessions, 1.5 hours. So all of us have been working on pulling together the slides based on the feedback that you all provided yesterday. And so we want to double check those kind of expectations with you, make sure we captured everything that you said to us correctly. And then we'll start prioritizing some of those next steps and action items that we captured, and particularly identifying maybe some of those low-hanging fruits for NBS options and for kind of next steps on how to explore those depending on where you're at in the process. I also want to just say that we captured some of the questions that we weren't able to get to in that second morning session on the board over here. I actually think in reviewing these that we'll probably hit most of those today in the case study and the ROI evaluation. But if at any point you have some clarifying questions around these, we can most certainly stop, have a discussion, and make sure that everyone's on the same page. Great. We're going to move into the first case study, which is the Greater Cape Town Water Fund. This is one of my favorite projects in our portfolio. I think it represents a really good example of a very straightforward nature-based solutions project. They're really focusing on one NBS and really scaling that quite well within the catchment system. And so because of that, they have a very, I think, pretty straightforward entry point to understanding nature-based solutions, the benefits of it, and then how it's kind of organized in a governance structure. So what you're seeing on the screen here is a reservoir that supplies Cape Town with water. The top picture is what the reservoir usually looks like, and the bottom picture is what the reservoir looked like in 2018 when Cape Town was at the brink of what they were calling day 0, which is when the water would run out and citizens would no longer have water to live in Cape Town. Water demand had been growing pretty steadily up until this drought. You'll see that between 2013 and 2023, they've had a rapid growth in population for the city of Cape Town. And you'll note that there's a marked drop in the water demand during the drought crisis. And that's because they instituted some really heavy demand management, I would say pretty restrictive demand management interventions. As you'll see, post-drought, water demand has steadily climbed back up and peaked during some heat waves that Cape Town had in 2021 and 2022. And it's not quite up again at pre-drought levels, but the city of Cape Town fully expects that it will reach those levels again within the next 2 to 3 years. So in response to this prediction around increased water use, increased frequency of droughts, and the increased severity of droughts, the city of Cape Town is looking into a number of intervention opportunities, water demand management being one of them, but also wastewater reuse, seawater desalination, and also deep aquifer drilling. So Cape Town's water comes from these really beautiful, picturesque escarpments that you see in this photo. It trickles down into the Western Cape water supply system, which is fed and supplied by a series of reservoirs within the watershed. And this is one area where the city of Cape Town had been working for decades to improve the supply of water that is flowing into Cape Town. And what we mean by that is invasive species removal. So what you're seeing on the screen here are the natural habitat that is usually in the Cape Town region. They're called fynbos. They're pretty awesome. There's 9,000 plant species in the Greater Cape region that are not found anywhere else in the world. They're so unique to this region that they're actually called the Cape Floristic Kingdom. And so fynbos have been naturally adapted to this ecosystem for millennia. They're really drought tolerant. They don't burn very quickly, very hot, and they allow a lot of replenishment to those aquifers that Cape Town relies on. Unfortunately, the catchment is pretty much filled with these very water-thirsty invasive alien plants. It's mostly pine and eucalyptus that were brought over during colonial periods. And you can see that the invasive trees allow maybe 16% of annual rainfall to replenish the groundwater versus the 40% that the native fynbos habitat allows to infiltrate into the groundwater. So 2/3 of the region's catchments actually are invaded by these alien trees, and the government had for really tons of decades really been trying to capture, remove a lot of these invasive alien plant species, but it was done so in sort of an uncoordinated, poorly funded manner. Unfortunately, because the coordinated response to invasive species was not up to the task, the current state was that 55 billion liters of water were being lost per year to these invasive species. And the science says that if current trends continue, it would actually increase to 100 billion liters per year by 2045. Like I mentioned, the government had been investing in invasive clearings for a number of years, but because of a combination of funding, implementation, governance barriers, unfortunately, they hadn't really achieved the outcomes that they were hoping to achieve. They were really relying heavily on government funding, which was inconsistent and often insufficient in size to tackle the extent of invasive alien plants in the catchment. They were aware loosely that there was this connection between the invasive alien plants and the amount of water that was available to the city, but there was a really unclear cost benefit that said, yes, we should invest millions of dollars in removing these invasive species because it will be cost effective for the city as compared to these other great infrastructure opportunities that they were looking at. Additionally, implementation was really fragmented. So Cape Town had been working on it as a city government in terms of invasive species removal. They had been contracting out to WWF. The Nature Conservancy had been working in the region, and primarily from a biodiversity standpoint because of the really incredible fynbos habitat there. Because we were all working in these silos, there was really this lack of prioritization and focus. You know, where are the most important places for water supply in the catchment? Where are we working there? How are we preventing future spread of invasives? And so there wasn't this kind of overarching strategy for the catchment itself. The cleared areas were not maintained. So you would cut a tree down and then the winds would come, carry the seeds would replenish the area, new pine would grow in the area that you had just cleared. There was no follow-up maintenance. Additionally, and this was a really big one, teams are not working in high altitude areas. Most of the areas that were really accessible for clearing were in these valleys. And as you saw in that photo, there's really steep escarpments in Cape Town. And so nobody was actually making the treks up there to clear those pines that are on these ridge lines. So when the wind came, again, seeds were taken, replenished all of the area that had previously been cleared. So they were really kind of kicking themselves and shooting themselves in the foot because they just weren't able to mobilize enough funding, implementation, coordination together. So during the drought, TNC said, maybe we can take advantage of this crisis. Maybe we can figure out a way to kind of, now that we have the attention of the public, bring nature-based solutions to the forefront because we believe that it could be a viable, cost-effective solution for water security in the region. And watershed investment programs, or as Cape Town calls them, catchment investment programs, really help bridge some of those key governance, funding, and implementation challenges that were previously discussed on the last slide. To make the business case, they conducted a 30-year planning and modeling exercise to look at the unit cost of nature-based solutions, so invasive clearing removal, as compared to the other things that the government was thinking about investing in. They really partnered with the government on this business plan to get accurate cost benefit information to come up with that unit cost. As you can see, removing invasive alien plants in the priority subcatchments is remarkably low in cost compared to the other interventions that they're looking at. I should note that Cape Town will have to invest in these other great infrastructure options. Invasive species clearing alone is not going to solve the problem, but it is a critical piece to the puzzle, and that's really what we were trying to get the government to see. To make that argument, the Greater Cape Town Water Fund modeled a variety of different scenarios to kind of show the future with and without nature-based solutions. They showed this kind of no action scenario. So, you know, if we did not do anything, if we stopped all invasive clearing removal, what would happen to the percentage of invasives in the catchment? And then what is the resulting impact to that annual stream flow reduction? Additionally, we looked at business as usual. So if we just kept moving things the way they were, if TNC still did its work in one catchment, WWF did its work in another catchment, Cape Town did its work in another, what would that look like in terms of the invasive level and then obviously the resulting stream flow? That bottom blue line that you see there is if we were to implement nature-based solutions, so the invasive clearing to its maximum. So if we were to remove all invasive species in these priority subcatchments where we're looking, what would that do to reduce the invasive level and increase stream flow, especially during the dry season? So the analysis told us that we should focus on 7 priority subcatchments. So this is important to note. There are invasive species throughout the entire catchment. However, these 7 priority subcatchments are of particular importance to the water supply for the city of Cape Town. And so that's where we're focusing our initial investment, because it will make the biggest difference in terms of the water that are flowing into some of those large reservoirs and dam systems. So focusing on those 7 priority catchments would reclaim 74% of the current water losses, and that's by focusing on only 35% of the Western Cape water supply system. We looked at what the cost would be over the life cycle of the program. You'll see there's a really large spike in the initial 6 years, and that's because we were thinking about this really high altitude area. So accessing this high altitude area, which are particularly important for stopping the recolonization of pine species in these low-lying areas. To reach those high areas, it costs a lot of time, energy, money. You have to train people to rappel down the side of mountains, saw off these pine species with their hands, and then rappel back up, and they stay about 2 weeks per trip out in the catchment. And so it required a lot of really intensive training, a lot of dedicated time and energy. And of course, a helicopter is not inexpensive, but very effective for the program. When we looked at full implementation costs, we wanted to figure out who was benefiting most from this. So the kind of blue box system that you see on the left-hand side, that is the dams that would benefit the most, so the reservoirs that would receive the most benefit from the invasive clearing removal. And then we looked at per investment or user, what the avoided yield reduction would be. So obviously the city of Cape Town, which supplies the water for citizens, is the largest beneficiary, but agriculture is also a really important beneficiary in that region. And I should note that during the 2018 drought for Cape Town, we saw a lot of farmer suicide and a lot of loss of crops and livestock in the area. So the Greater Cape Town Water Fund was set up as a public-private partnership, primarily driven by the Nature Conservancy as the secretariat. We were the ones who were trying to push this program forward, conduct the analyses, make sure all the stakeholders were on board, liaising with the board members, which is sort of an advisory group of public and private partners together, including PepsiCo, WWF, the city of Cape Town itself, And then we had 3 initial working groups at the beginning, which were identified as the most important things to mobilize additional funding in the future, aside from the City of Cape Town, because the City of Cape Town said, this is really important for us, but we also want private sector investment in this watershed. So those were the Data and Ops Working Group, which determines where in the watershed is the most priority locations to implement in over a 3 to 5 year period. Then we had the M&E Working Group, which was monitoring that implementation, but then also monitoring the impacts of that implementation. So setting up the strategic stream gauges, making sure that they're coordinating between all of the partners who are still carrying out separate implementation, but now under one prioritized strategy. And then also the Sustainable Funding Working Group, because as I mentioned, they were really keen on private sector involvement, and there's no shortage of corporations who are operating in the greater Cape Town area who do benefit from that water supply and are heavy water users. These are just more examples of the public and private partnership that we were able to pull together. As you can see, it's wide spanning from food and beverage to NGOs to investment banks as well. This is a video. I don't know if it'll play. Yeah.
We're gonna anchor our ropes here by these trees, and then we're gonna abseil down. So we're looking for the invasive species. So we get up in the morning, we get breakfast. After breakfast, we get all our gear together and gear up and head out to site. When we get to the site, we anchor our ropes, and then we start ascending down the cliffs. The most important thing, like in that whole process, is safety first, because we walk really high up, and as we ascend from really high.
It's weather we must deal with every day. Sometimes it's warm, sometimes it's cold, but we keep working.
My family, they believed in me. For the first time I did the training, they know that I'm a shero. So I have to be focused when I'm hanging. It's too risky if you are not focused.
When I'm on a rope, sometimes scary, sometimes thrilling.
Cutting at the aliens will help a lot because those trees absorb a lot of water. When we cut at these trees that are not wanted, there will be more water that's coming to our dams.
This is hard work, but what makes it worth it is that I'm doing something that I love. It feels great knowing that everyone has proper access to water and that I am part of making that happen.
Thanks, guys. While we're getting the PowerPoint back up, one of the women that you saw in the video, Nellie, she's part of a gender equity program that we started with the Coca-Cola Foundation, and it was about increasing the number of women who are involved in the invasive clearing consultancies. So she went through the mentorship program, and they actually started her own consultancy itself. And so now she's able to bid with her team on the contracts that are put out by the Greater Cape Town Water Fund. And so it was just a way to increase jobs and increase jobs for women as well in this very male-dominated field within Cape Town. Oh, line again, there we go. Okay, so this is the progress to date. So there have been initial clearance of 31,000 hectares, and there's follow-up hectares that have been cleared, which essentially means that those hectares have been maintained and they've come through a second or third time to ensure that there are no more pine species in that region. There is now 17.1 billion liters of water available per year, and they've created over 787 green jobs in the region. And for an area where unemployment is particularly high, this was an important co-benefit for the government of Cape Town to invest such a great amount of money in the program. Of those 787, there are 151 of those high angle technicians that you saw rappelling down from the mountainside and doing that grueling work of sawing those pines by hand. So the Greater Cape Town Water Fund coordinates all of its investment decisions and monitoring information in this online decision support system that is publicly available to any stakeholder, including the public within the Greater Cape Town region. They have broken down these 7 priority subcatchments into what they call hydrological management units. So they are small units that are easy to access within 1 or 2 days of each other. And those are how they prioritize the most important areas for invasive species clearing. They have a scenario modeler that estimates those benefits and costs so that when new money comes in, they're able to prioritize the highest and best use of those dollars. And they also are able to track clearing has gone on, who actually cleared those. So is it Cape Nature? Is it TNC? Is it WWF? Is it the Cape Town region itself? And then they're also able to track all of the real-time stream gauge data that shows how much water is flowing into those water bodies that eventually makes it into those dams. So just as a reminder, this is what the Cape Town region looks like, and we're hoping to reverse and reclaim 55 billion liters of water per year, which is about 2 months of water supply for the city of Cape Town. So I'm going to leave it at that and open it up to any questions or discussion from folks. Isao.
Thank you, Brooke, for your great presentation. I really like this. It's really a convincing business case. I like your scenario analysis without actions. And there's a good information about cost effectiveness and main beneficiaries even. That's a great information, really convincing. I have a question for both you and our project officers. I would like to seek your comments. The question is about the planning. I mean, the duration, the length of the planning. You said 30-year planning. That's really a long term. And then I would like to seek your advice. How long do we need to seek? Do we need to consider to get the real good ideas about the cost effectiveness, for example, cost benefit analysis. Also for the project officers, I wonder what you think about this 30-year planning. When we think about our investment, do we take that long-term perspective? How can we address this kind of time issue in terms of estimating the benefit and cost of our investment? Thank you.
Yeah. So the time horizon and the reason why we chose 30 years is twofold. So one, we worked with the city of Cape Town to figure out what time horizon they were comfortable with. So if they're considering investing in additional gray infrastructure assets, they wanted to know the life cycle costs and the maintenance costs of at least 30 years of a nature-based solution program so that they could make comparisons around costs required to operate and maintain some of the gray infrastructure assets that they were looking into investing in. Additionally, because nature-based solutions can take a longer time to mature and reach its full potential, it's usually best practice to look out at least 20 to 30 years, especially if you're considering something around restoration, because it will take time for those assets to mature and nature to kind of do its job so that it is functioning well, and you can kind of see those long-term benefits actually realized from the investment itself. So that's sort of why we looked at it for Cape Town. So it's comparable to assets for the government, and so that they could see the long-term realization of those benefits.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. That was really interesting. I'm just wondering, I mean, how do you stop these invasive species from regenerating? I guess you've trained all these skilled people now. Was there a plan then to, was it included in the plan and the forecast that there'd be a task force maintained to do periodic repassing through all the catchments to keep the numbers down?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's usually an initial clearing. And so I can go back to it, but if you'll recall that cost curve where it has that really high initial spike, and then there's kind of that long tail. There we go. There's kind of that long tail. Those are kind of the follow-up costs associated with making sure that there are no initial invasive species coming back to repopulate that area. So that's sort of our plan. They are looking at other things now aside from manual removal, which could potentially include like pest removal. Basically, they would use a pest to target these large swaths of forest that they are unable to get to, maybe lower the cost, but they're very concerned about pest introduction, unsure how that would impact the native fynbos habitat. So I think it'll be many, many, many years before they feel comfortable kind of going down that route. But yeah, there is long-term maintenance costs included with this.
Yeah, just one more thing. Some of those trees look pretty big as well.
There.
What do you do with them when they're cut? Just leave them to rot, or is there some removal? And secondly, surely they can't all be cut with hand saws. Are these people hanging off with chainsaws as well?
Most of the trees in the high altitude areas, because they are so high altitude, they don't grow as big as the ones that are kind of in the valleys. So they are pretty much hand cutting for the most part. Occasionally they will take a chainsaw if it is, too massive, but for the most part, hand sawing is just way safer, especially when you're hanging off of a rope. To dispose of the trees themselves, they've done everything from like burning to mulching to composting. But honestly, they've asked the government if the government would be interested in milling them and using them for lumber, and the government's just not interested. So the result of all of this pine invasion is actually because the government has basically abandoned pine plantations, and now it is populating and repopulating the rest of the catchment. So they're not interested in using. Eric.
There are also, in some areas, local communities will take the wood and use it for construction. So they'll pile the wood up into these kind of teepee structures, and then the local communities come and take them.
Thank you. Lyndon?
Yeah, so sharing a question from the Zoom chat. Was there any public backlash against removal of trees Because for those who don't understand invasive species, any cutting of trees is perceived as destruction and not environmentally friendly.
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. So the government invested in a awareness raising campaign to basically show the connection between these invasive species and the lack of water. And because they were in an incredible drought at the time, there was not a ton of public pushback on removal of the trees because one, they're non-native, so they're restoring something that's culturally and ecologically significant to the city of Cape Town and that whole region. And it will also alleviate this terrible drought that they're in now and into the future. So not a ton of pushback, but I think partially because there was a really great awareness campaign. Other questions? So here.
Okay, great. I think it's good to learn this kind of example from other regions because we are Asian Development Bank, and knowing from South Africa, that's great. You know, in our case, so I'm actually trying to connect the dots, you know, with the different issues based on your presentation. So in many cases, we have to deal with a mega city. Population size is about 25 millions. Cape Town is like what, 4.5 million people. And then, so in our case, we are really trying to diversify water sources, right? I mean, in most cases that we need to invest for the large investment, like maybe the dam is maybe one extreme case that we really need to invest. But in Asian Development Bank, we have many constraints to invest for the dam construction, primarily because of the social safeguard, environmental safeguard restrictions. But then, so then the other alternative source that we go is groundwater extractions. And then this is not recommended by us because, you know, we are scary. You know, I think the water resources, underground water resources limited. Then, I just wonder how you address this issue of the groundwater resource, the extractions. That's maybe one question. I think South Africa has a reasonably good governance of the municipality. I think their operation is not the worst. I think they do have some basic arrangement in place. So how do they manage with the NGOs, private sector organization coming to do this kind of activities? So those are somewhat relevant to our region because we always have to deal with the municipality, and this is the cases. And in most cases that they manage their own water supply sanitation operations and maintenance. But in some cases, they also subcontract with a concession agreement or other PPP arrangement with the company like Veolia. You touch on that issues. So how do they come into that? Yeah, so that's maybe something that we are doing on a daily basis. Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. So I'll start with the government kind of interaction and how they coordinate with the Cape Town Water Fund. So the government was very involved. In fact, they were the leading champion that helped to set up the Greater Cape Town Water Fund. So without government kind of helping to mobilize and bring additional stakeholders along and speaking up and saying, we want to put our time and energy and effort behind this water fund, this mechanism, I don't think other people would have joined as quickly as they did. So they played a really big role in kind of galvanizing additional support and bringing people along for the journey and saying, yeah, okay, we'll look into investing in this. If the government says it's important and they're putting their weight behind it, we'll also consider. So the government was very upfront with us and basically said, you know, look, we don't have the capacity to manage the program ourselves. We've been trying to scale up invasive species removal for decades, and it's just not working as well. We're open to trying a different mechanism. So the government stays involved, whether that's city government or departments within the city government, they stay involved as part of the steering committee, part of working groups. They're stakeholders that are very involved in decision-making and how the process is moving forward. And Cape Town now is kind of moving, they're in a 2-year process to move to an independent entity. So we'll no longer be hosted within the Nature Conservancy and will be completely a separate entity that will be managed by its own individual staff. And so the government is really keen on helping to support that transition and kind of design what that end result of the governance body will look like and how it will function. So they're quite involved in that. As for kind of groundwater extraction, the city of Cape Town is also going to invest in that. There's just no way that they can meet the growth that they need through invasive species removal alone. They are going to invest in groundwater extraction. And part of the reason that they are looking at some of that groundwater extraction and invested in invasive species removal is because some of the water will end up flowing into the dam system, but a lot of it will end up in that groundwater. So the invasive species removal is actually kind of doing twofold. It's increasing groundwater infiltration, and it's also increasing the water that ultimately ends up in those reservoirs, those surface water reservoirs. And so they will engage in groundwater extraction. We at the Nature Conservancy won't really support with that because that's not our bread and butter, but we will continue to remove the invasive species to ensure that the groundwater quality and quantity is solid underneath. Yeah. Mark. Victor.
Yes. I would just like to build on the discussion, unless your topic is linked to Kiyoshi-san's remarks or questions. Okay, then because I think great presentation, great discussion. This is not just a project. I think it's beyond a project, you know, in terms of what we're doing in the clinic. We have a project. Now, time horizon is like 30 years, right? And it includes social change. I think that's the key point with the government, with the other stakeholders, and then TNC pulling out. So my question is, how long does the social change happen? Where does it sit in this time horizon? The other part is like, we also operate projects in a different time frame. Our policies, they change like what, 5 years? We have country strategy partnerships updated every 3-5 years. And those are the things that kind of determine the direction of our projects. And now also NBS. So there's just kind of like this difference on how this project works, the Cape Town on a 30 years horizon, and those kind of guiding policies or documents that we follow when we kind of consider ADB's projects and other projects as well, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. So in other cases where we've helped development finance institutions invest in those projects, they are looking at like a 3 to 5 year time horizon. However, the important part is DFIs can play sort of this catalytic role in helping identify and set up the initial program that could continue running long after the DFI funding has kind of left and been paid back. And so that's really like the role that DFIs tend to play when we set up these programs. They provide the initial funding, set up capacity building for government and other stakeholders to get involved. I will say when we work with AFD in Senegal, they paid for like the pre-feasibility and the feasibility analysis, and TNC helped kind of define what that might look like over a time horizon. And then the government got a loan from AFD to kind of help support and implement that. They will continue that project forward over 30 years to continue maintenance and expand the project. And they're going to look at other potential sources of funding. But ADB or AFD played a really important role in that initial investment, ideation, and capacity building. Yeah, Eric.
And this was one of the questions which came up yesterday, which is halfway down the questions we've written down there on the whiteboard. It's also relevant when we think about private sector involvement. I think Coca-Cola will be very excited about a project for maybe 2 years, but they're unlikely to be excited for 30 years. And that's where thinking about how the money needed for a project over time is important. We can see here in Cape Town, the lion's share of the investment is in the first 5 or 6 years. And then there's a long-term amount of lower amounts of maintenance funding required, which maybe is more relevant for local public sector. So it also depends on what kind of activity you're delivering through that program and how you kind of stack up those different funding flows coming in.
Yeah, so Cape Town set theirs up as a collective action vehicle. So they had some large initial funding sources that allowed them to kind of build that initial track record to attract those larger long-term buckets of funding to kind of keep and maintain that maintenance required for the impacts. And so that's really where I feel like DFIs have traditionally played a role, because you are so influential and it is attractive to other investors to invest alongside a large development bank.
That's very interesting. This graph, like a 5-year, a large amount of investment. It's like a project,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is it working? Yeah, it's working. Thanks. Well, I just didn't. I also wanted to jump in on the groundwater harvesting.
Yeah.
So especially, this was an issue. Perhaps continues to be an issue in the Philippines, just because it's not a systematized, planned out approach. Everyone is getting their water supply from groundwater, and so subsidence is an issue. Saltwater infiltration is also an issue, and so I mean, this is one really has to look at the hydrological cycle and the recharging of the groundwater, if this is going to be an actual strategy for the city, as an example. But my question is actually to do with, and this is something that's been popping in my head since yesterday. How does one then, so you have this program that actually gets better over time, in a sense, because you're planning more, you're taking out the pine, and then and whatever else you're doing, and then the service just gets better and better. So my question is, how does one, like if you had a gray infrastructure, physical infrastructure, you would have like a turnover date, right? And you would turn. Well, you have your O&M, you can program all of that, you can devaluate, it devaluates over time. Maybe that's why you needed a 30-year horizon, I think, if I understood correctly. You were so that they could make a cost comparison with their gray assets, right? And which they were probably, giving a 30-year life to it or something like that. So my question is, how does one, like, so that would be unique to nature-based solutions. Is it that there's no turnover? Can you speak of a turnover date? And then is that part of when you say, okay, your benefits are, this is how the benefits are going to happen over time? And is that part of then the business, the business solution, or the business document, that makes it, this is why it makes economic sense. And then your O&M is probably reducing versus your gray solutions, and so on and so forth. So this is, how is it in practical terms? Like, if we had to speak with the Ministry of Public Works and Highways, can they get this? Like yesterday, somebody was saying it's not about creating assets, it's about the system solution. And I was thinking overnight, do a lot of ministries appreciate that, and how long will it take for them to appreciate that, so that this is actually considered the option of choice, for instance? Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, Ben? No, you go ahead.
So I'm just going to own that I was the one that said you got to think about the systems. And tell you for a fact that they get it, because we are not talking about green or grey assets. We're talking about assets, and assets are part of a network, and a network solves problems. And I think what you could, and we're also talking about dams that have a 100-year life. And if we're not thinking about the life cycle costs of those dams, we're essentially giving the future costs and benefits a zero value. And so I'm going to do a little plug for the discussion that Eric and I are going to lead later. But how do you think about the life cycle costs over the life of your grey infrastructure over the life of your green infrastructure so it's a fair comparison? So that when you think about your assets as part of a network, providing solutions into a system, it makes sense. You're optimizing the system, not just thinking about a specific project or a specific asset, but you're starting to look at how you understand the link between how your assets solve problems, how your projects contribute to a network, and that network is part of a broader integrated system. So, and I guess the last point I'd make is that I get that you've got to meet people where they are. You know, 6-foot bald economists come storming into a room and say, we've got to talk about the system. That's not going to work. But if we say that these are about managing assets and thinking about the life cycle costs and benefits of those assets in a comparable way, and also importantly, when we start to get approval for the project, we're saying here is a sustainable revenue stream for that project, and this is how we're going to shift the asset maintenance into your existing asset management systems. It's no longer talking about whether or not the project proceeds. It's actually how do we turn it into business as usual. So yeah, so just a couple of thoughts there.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, the only thing I would add is that when we talk to government officials, we usually say like the asset is the catchment. The asset is your forest, it's your wetland, it's the piece of kind of environmental ecology that you are restoring its natural function to. And I think in the particular instance of Cape Town, what was really helpful now is that there are other locations within South Africa that are experiencing the same issue. Pines are everywhere across South Africa, sucking up a bunch of water in different river systems and different catchments for different cities. And now they have this archetype because they've tested it in Cape Town, and now they're picking it up and they're going to apply it in 7 additional basins across South Africa. And the government of Cape Town is going alongside the Nature Conservancy to say, you know, this is our experience in Cape Town. You can now replicate this in other locations. Here's the strong business case behind it. In fact, one of the examples that Eric gave yesterday on Kruger to Canyons, K2C, in that like very quick rundown, they're also doing invasive clearing. It's kind of picking up and moving from Cape Town. Last comment to Eric.
Last comment, no pressure. If you recall yesterday, we had a slide about how there are many different ways to do catchment management. And that's also true regarding the future involvement of the ministry. So that kind of 30 years of maintenance, the bars of the maintenance cost going from year 6 to year 30, the ministry doesn't necessarily need to be involved in that. Maybe that's local government funding a local NGO and the ministry is not doing anything there. Or maybe it's the ministry hiring 50 people to go and do that work itself, or maybe it's a different solution. So there are different, the nice thing about water is that everybody needs it. And if there's none, then it's a problem for all of the different ministries and all of the different layers of government. So it's not necessarily the Ministry of Highways and Infrastructure or whoever that needs to be doing, you know, needs to be attending stakeholder meeting in year 8 or contracting people in year 13. That can be a different entity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, we're going to move to Ben now for the sake of time.
Brooke, good morning, everyone. We've had a fantastic discussion about going deep on a particular project. I'm going to go really broad now. It's in urban areas, whether or not it's in the Pacific, Asia, Europe, Australia. People say 3 things. The first thing they say is that sounds good, but our place is different. It might work in Australia or it might work in Vietnam, but it may not. We don't understand how it's going to work here. And then the second one is, if it's going to work, how do we do it in a way that is appropriate for our place at scale? We've seen lots of pilot projects. How do we actually scale it up and lock it into existing business as usual? And then the third really important question that they ask is, who is going to pay? You know, and how do we make sure that the funding is available over the life cycle of the assets so that we respond to the great question that happened a moment ago about making sure that these assets are maintained and they deliver value over the long term. So that's pretty common in my travels. And I look at the board from the questions from yesterday, and I can also see those there. And that's why the Resilient Urban Centres and Surrounds or RUCKUS program was established, basically to look at those three questions, to do a first phase of engagement, and that's bringing together ministries at a national level, municipalities and departments at a provincial level, universities, and increasingly the private sector, to try and have a conversation about what's getting in the way of applying these nature-based solutions in a way that's appropriate, in a way that is scalable, in a way that is financeable and sustainable from both an economic and a technical point of view. First of all, we start by bringing those groups together, awareness raising, understanding the context. Then it's deep dive into case studies to do some action learning. So let's move this from a theoretical to a practical discussion about particular places. And then we say, well, how do we take that understanding, come up with some concepts that will work here and build the economic case for action. We have been, RUCKUS has been going for about 2 years, 2 and a bit, coming up on our 3rd year. And we're now moving from case studies and awareness raising to piloting. But sitting around this is an upscaling strategy. So basically saying before we start a pilot, we want a really clear blueprint and agreement from the key parties in each place about what are we going to do after the pilot. So it's just a means to an end, not an end point. Each of the case studies follow a 5-step process. The first step is to just make sure that we understand the context. So even though we might be talking about a particular city or a particular part of a city, like the area in the circle, in the polygon there, we actually make sure that we understand how that city works with the rest of how that part of the city works with the rest of the whole city, and how the city contributes and is affected by the rest of the catchment. So it's this, again, thinking about a particular part of a broader urban system connected to a broader catchment. You might have heard me talking about hybrid solutions. We do not argue about, is it green or is it grey or is it community-based? It's what is the right mix of those 3 things, and how do we compare them on a like-for-like basis so that we come up with a good portfolio of responses. We heard from Brooke a moment ago that, managing the catchment appropriately is part of an integrated solution for Cape Town. How do we get that right mix, understanding that the cost structure, the maintenance regime, finance these different types of assets might be different. So we need to get them onto a comparable basis. We tend to use benefit cost analysis, and Eric and I will talk a little bit more about that shortly, to say, well, what is the return to, say, the water utility or the municipality? But more importantly, what is the return to everybody? And we look at the distribution of the costs. Who is getting the costs and who is getting the benefits? Because when you understand who is getting the benefits, you might also have a better understanding of who should pay. Importantly, too, gender equity, social disability inclusion and social diversity are really key parts of each of these phases. It's not something that we think about in the end. It's embedded in the designs, it's embedded in the economic analysis. And when we look at the distribution of costs and benefits, we make sure that we're thinking about those groups. And any upscaling strategy will be making sure that the concepts that are developed are revisited and reviewed and reflect the views of the different groups that are going to be impacted by the project. So responding to the common question of we're different, our place is unique, what we have done with RUCKUS is pick a diverse array of case studies from across the Lower Mekong region, one in each capital city of Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand, and one in a secondary city. We've also, so we have populations ranging from cities of 10 million down to villages of about 13,000. We also have very different geology and hydrological situations. We've looked down at the delta areas and much further up in the catchments. Also, the mix of climate impacts are very different as well. Some areas it's about pluvial flooding, it might be fluvial flooding elsewhere, it might be temperature, it might be drought, or in most cases, it's a combination of those 3 things. And in most of these case studies, we might start by talking about, say, flooding, but we quickly end up having a conversation about flooding and drought. And how do we come up with interventions that deliver value every day in a way that also is there and working well for extreme events? So I'm not going to, I'd love to talk about all of these. I can't, I don't have time, I'll get in trouble. So what I'm going to do is pick just some very different examples. So first of all, we're going to talk about how do you integrate NBS into a very large high density city. Then we'll talk about a regional centre with really important cultural and historical values, because we heard that was an important issue yesterday. And then finally, we'll look at the peri-urban area around the outside of the city. How do we protect the important green areas around our cities as our cities grow in a way that helps us avoid the problems that a lot of the other case studies are actually responding to? And we've picked these because they also respond to some of the issues that are raised in the clinic sessions over yesterday and in the pre-discussions as well. I'll also add that these 8 case studies add to 4 from a previous phase of the work in Vietnam and Thailand, and another 2 in China as well. So over time, we're building up this database of regional specific but very diverse case studies, so that when someone says to me, we're different, well, we say, that's true, you are, but maybe there's one of these case studies that or a combination of the different case studies that can show how NBS might add value to your particular place. Okay, so let's talk about Bangkok, high density city. We started this project looking at a park. So you might be able to see there down here, Benjikiti Park, a gift from the royal family to the people of Bangkok, a really important green asset in a very big grey city. The initial ideas, the request were to say, well, how do we actually improve that park's capacity to not only look beautiful, but provide important flood protection and improve the quality of water? So we looked at how within the park and the big storage area, we could soften the bank when the water levels are low, and it adds value when water levels are high, and it's providing flood protection. We also looked at some of the surface level wetlands there and recommended subsurface level wetlands because the load that was flowing into them was too high for surface level. So we provided some advice about how this really important pre-existing green asset could add more value, but we quickly looked at the important role and the broader area. So we noted that it's providing an important job of catching floodwaters, but we also looked north of the park up in here and saying, well, where's that floodwater coming from? Can we actually do some small scale things to take to do detention and take some of the peak out of the flows that are flooding into this park and downstream? So is there an opportunity to look at a network of green infrastructure, large and small, so that we're activating the private realm up here, working with large hotels, community groups, schools, so that this large asset and small assets are working well together. We also noted that even though there's a fantastic park here, there's also Lumpini Park, just about a kilometre walk, not far away, and you get a lot more value out of connected parks and a network of parks than you do isolated pockets of green in a big grey city. And there's a pre-existing walkway between these 2 parks. It runs along a canal, and that canal already, the Thai are ahead of the game. They've already got their local concept of monkey cheeks for detention, and there's some linear wetlands that run along this walkway. Water's pumped out, it's treated, and it's put back in. And it's also creating area for biodiversity and a really good recreation. So we said, well, what else can we do to improve the NBS along this walkway here? So instead of starting off as a project with one big green asset, because space is a premium and that's a fantastic gift to the city of Bangkok, how do we use NBS at different scales in a connected way so they work together? Just like your pipes and pumps in water and sewage side of things work together, this is an NBS network working together. And when we did the benefit cost analysis, we looked at the contribution of Benjikiti Park, the connecting Baisingto Canal, and the distributed NBS in the northern area. We did a benefit cost analysis of those, looking at the costs and the benefits over 30 years, the full life cycle of the assets. And we found that actually the area of biggest value was in focusing on the canal. upgrading the park would be great, but the place to start would be looking at the canal. And that was because the difference between the quality now and the improved quality, the value of the property now and the value of the property in the future was really significant. So there's one example of how you can look at different scales. I mean, we were talking about Kamatas Park yesterday, and we were saying it's a fantastic park, great opportunity. How do we look at the area around the park so that the MBS is adding value to the people in the park and contributing to broader values around? And again, as part of the engagement process, we were talking with our colleagues in country, providing some preliminary technical information, some economic information, and some visualization of what it could look like. And we had some lively discussions about saying, Ben, you're mad, that bit won't work, but this bit's really good. So it's, and the next phase of the work could evolve those designs in a collaborative way. Another example, so we're looking there at an existing park, but we know that every scrap of land in a growing city is really important. And within Bangkok, for example, there's a 15-minute park strategy. So they've set it themselves a strategy of being within a 15-minute walk to a park. There's a strategy of planting 1 million trees. And BMA, the Water and Drainage and Sewage Authority of Bangkok, are planning to develop around 170 parks. So there is not enough green space to do all of that using existing. So we need to bring some of the old land back to life. And this is on Noot Park. It's actually a collaboration that between BMA and PTTGC. So a public and private collaboration, taking a formal waste transfer site and turning it into a green lung for the area. And I guess this was already happening, and we were privileged to join with them and the Department of Climate Change and Environment and say, what else could we do? So they was already turning the area from just a grey, they'd removed most of the waste just from so it was really dirt. And now I was there, this is a photo taken earlier in the year. And so it's certainly come back into a green space. And we're saying, well, the first thing we need to do is to understand any potential contamination issues from the legacy. Most of the waste has been gone, but we want to make sure that whatever we do next is safe. Can we add a wetland to this green area, create more biodiversity, more habitat, increase the value there, and also add more types of recreation? So yesterday when we were talking about Kamatas, we were saying, well, how do we bring the local community into the construction of the assets? That's happening here. And how do we actually create a place that is valued by and utilised by the community so that they become champions of it and its upgrade? So what we've actually done is say, well, let's look at 3 scenarios, the work that's already happening, and that had a return through the benefit cost analysis of $40 back to the community for every $1 investment. And that was largely because it was designed as a really low maintenance park, but also providing a level of amenity that is reflecting of that low level of maintenance. We also then looked at, well, if we add a wetland, we're going to get more biodiversity value, more recreational value, the benefits go up. And then we said, what happens if we're looking at a place that has high levels of contamination? What would that look like? What would we need to do to be able to make it safe? And then what could we do in terms of bringing as much amenity and recreational potential into that fully remediated site as we could? And so the benefits were much bigger, but also across those 3 scenarios in the blue boxes, higher benefits also involves higher costs. So we had a significant, we showed a significant return of the first, going from basically a brownfield site to a green site, 40 to 1. But we also achieved $10 return for each of the 2 scenarios in adding more value to those sites or looking at the full remediation option. So again, happy to take any questions, but what I was trying to do here is to show that NBS is possible in a big city when you think about it as a connected network, and when you start to think about opportunities to not just use existing parks, but actually bring previously unloved land back to life in a safe way. And I guess coming from this now, we're talking about upscaling. So for this particular, each case study will have different upscaling activities. But for this one, we're looking at developing guidelines for risk assessment of these sorts of sites to support application in wider places? And how do we get that risk assessment mainstreamed into normal business practices? And we're also saying one of the most significant assumptions that we had was the increase in biodiversity. So we're going to do some work to actually understand, instead of taking analysis from other places and applying it here, we're going to do some biodiversity with the local university to say, well, and then that's going to create a better baseline for other application to other places within Bangkok. Okay, so I'll keep moving. So we've looked at a very large city. Now let's look at a regional centre with really important cultural values. So we'll go over the border to Laos and Luang Prabang, a really important heritage city. We'll share a video with you just to sort of provide a little bit more context. But it is probably the most important heritage site in Laos. Part of that is a network of canals or ponds, a network of ponds that are a mix of public and private ownership. They're quite small, so they range from an area that is about the size of this room to very small sort of household ponds. They have been actively used for agriculture, aquaculture, and also flood detention. So it's a really interesting example of nature-based solutions providing private value and public good. Public good in terms of flood protection, private value in terms of income streams. But what is happening, the value of that land, just like in the big cities, is going up and up and up. And a lot of these ponds are being filled in and developed, or they're not being maintained appropriately, and there's odour issues, and the productivity of the land is going down significantly. So our aspiration with this project is to say, well, how can NBS help people understand and realise the value of these ponds privately in a way that also delivers, continues to deliver public good. So I'll keep going. And again, we're thinking about a connection of NBS, and these could be thought about in a modular way. So in terms of a set of typologies, we could say, well, at the household level, the first thing that we would like to do is to separate out the sewage, the black water, from the grey water. And when we're thinking when we get rid of the sewage, we've got more reuse opportunities for the grey water. Can we use a household scale treatment system like a worm farm? And I'll talk about that more in a second. Can that then go and to improve the water quality? And that then goes to a subsurface wetland, which then goes to a pond, to the heritage pond. We've got a range of ideas about how the value of those ponds can be uplifted and improved. We've also ideas around how the connection of the ponds can be improved as well to the broader canal network. And then also too, we note that another common activity is chicken farming, for example, and agriculture. Can we use the solid waste? So we're thinking about solid and liquid waste streams together. Can we separate the solid waste and look at composting? And can we actually use a berm that captures some of the runoff from those chicken coops, holds it back, pushes it through the ground to improve, to do some treatment before it gets into the groundwater table, but also provide a productive space for agriculture. Okay, so just a quick overview of each of these little modules or each of these strategies. First of all, we're saying, well, can we use worm farms? And we've looked at different sorts of media, including biochar, which is actually quite effective for treatment purposes. But the worm farms will not only help treat the waste, the worm castings and the worm tea are really good for agriculture. So there's a byproduct there that can help production. We're saying that we should look at a subsurface wetland. So the water from the wetland, from the worm farm, goes through the subsurface wetland, creating an irrigated space that can be used for agriculture. We're then saying when it goes into the pond, are there things that we can do with the pond? Can we look at the shape of the bottom of the pond to support aquaculture? Can we look at floating wetlands on top of the pond? So technology that's from Bangladesh that we know about. So for example, they could be frames made from bamboo, lightweight, low cost, use things like water hyacinth for the growing media, which is a weed in here. So we'd have to make sure that we're not sort of supporting the movement of weeds, but again, using a local waste product to generate more activity and more value for the pond. We're also looking at sorry, we're also looking at the connection between the ponds and the broader canal network. At the moment, when we met with the team over there, or the local community over there, the person who is responsible for that is the village elder. He's sprightly as a 30-year-old, but he's probably closer to 80. And he's every time it rains, he has to go out and manually turn the valve to open up, or the penstock to open up the. We actually put in place something that's more passive, something that automatically balances the different levels. And then finally, in terms of the other side, can we actually use, again, separating solid and solid waste, looking at the composting from the chicken coops, catching the runoff, doing some treatment of the runoff before it gets into the ponds. And then we have improved quality ponds for the greater use. So when we, and I guess also too, how do we do this in a way that promotes tourism? So there are, in this particular part of Luang Prabang, there is about 30 ponds, but there's many more scattered around the city. And those ponds are connected by canals. And there are some paths around those canals. And it's possible to, and there is some good signage already about the history of different canals, but we could potentially lean into that and start to think about our network of connected NBS in a way that provides a real asset that connects one part of the heritage city to the mighty Mekong. So we're sort of thinking about private value in a way that is connected to a broader network that delivers broader value to the community. So we also did an economic assessment of these. And I mentioned earlier, we think about them as modular strategies. So we looked at 2 private and 1 public pond, and a different combination of the 7 strategies in each of those places. Individually, the economic assessment said the benefits were greater than the costs, and collectively, the benefits were around, they were around 8 times the costs. Again, looking over a 30-year horizon. Sorry, a 20-year horizon. And the key source of benefits was the private benefit, but also things like providing flood protection and cooling for a really hot city. So again, you're sort of seeing, by thinking broadly about our costs and benefits, by thinking about different strategies for different places that can be combined into networks, we're starting to see that NBS integrated into the urban form can add a lot of value. Okay, so the last sort of typology I'll look at is how do we better understand and protect the value of our natural assets around the outside of our cities. And here we're going to the capital city of Laos, for Long Ian Marsh. And it is a much larger area than the little ponds that I was talking about, but some of the same ideas can be applied at a bigger scale. So the beautiful thing about NBS is that they're so scalable. Okay, so what we're doing here is starting to look at the marsh and the functioning of the marsh. And we've been delighted to partner with the Global Green Growth Institute, who are doing an existing project, looking at the flow of the water in, looking at and the flow of the water around and the flow of water out of this area as it comes in at the top and makes its way down to the Mekong River at the bottom. There is a mix of green and grey. So we're looking at improving some canal works, but also some, again, separating solid and liquid waste, or separating black and grey water. So there's a septics going in. But basically, what we're also thinking about it, if you can imagine, it looks a little bit like a hand there. We've got, and it drains from the fingers down to the palm of the hand. Down in the bottom here is an area that has some really good existing conservation value, some really good biodiversity. So how do we protect and enhance that value? And there's lots of opportunity down here for ecotourism. It's only about 7 kilometres from the heart of the city, and it's already being used for these sorts of recreational and commercial purposes. And so can we actually start to think about the other parts of protecting the quality of the water as it flows down into that important environmental area in a way that also brings economic return to the people that are locally, and they become advocates of protecting that land, because the business as usual case for wetlands like these, sadly, is that they are often filled in and there are condominiums or berets built on top of them. And each time I go to Cambodia, I go to the same places and I can see the march of sand and berets across these wetlands as development continues to expand. Sadly, within Laos, for example, I think they've lost around 50% of these sorts of wetlands, really important natural assets. And the way that some of these developments are being done is causing the problems that we're seeing in some already highly developed areas. So is there a problem? Is there a way to avoid these problems by better protection? And just really quickly, again, a set of 7 different, in this case, 8 different strategies, or thinking about 8 different zones, thinking about a zone for water treatment, thinking about zones for water flood management, thinking about different types of agriculture and productivity for dry land, for wetland, and for the ephemeral areas in between. And also thinking about how do we do this in a way that activates and empowers the local community. And so when we get to the, once we've made the economic case, when we get to the financing and funding side of it, we're also going to look really closely at governance. Is there some local governance of this area that really encourages people to be empowered and be stewards of this really important area? Okay. So again, in terms of a cross section, if you can imagine again, the tip of the finger is over here up in the north, and the palm is down here on the entrance to the mighty Mekong River. And so basically we're saying at the top of this system, we would be thinking about sedimentation and capturing solids. There would be an initial treatment through some stormwater wetlands. There's an existing road. So we want to make sure that the connection of the top and the bottom of the system is maintained. So there'd be some grey infrastructure there, a culvert. There'd be vegetated swales down here and a food forest. So looking at the different types from the tip of the trees down to the roots of the plants, how do we actually think about different combinations of food in a productive way? We're again sort of thinking about the ponds. There are a chain of little wetlands as we get our way down to the conservation area, and can we activate those ponds just like we were thinking about in Luang Prabang? And then as the water continues its way to the river, can we think about flood zones? So swamp forests, different types of biodiversity that add value in the wet and dry. And then we get down into the conservation area, and are there opportunities there to have ecotourism? And because a lot of people get out of Phnom Penh pretty regularly, they love to get out and experience nature. There's opportunities there to create local jobs and local industry in a way that is respectful of the local culture. And here too, what we're trying to do is think about the circular economy benefits of nature-based solutions. And so we're trying to make sure that the waste of one of these strategies is an input to another. So thinking about our different types of productivity, thinking about the outputs going to a local market. And yesterday, our colleagues from Bangladesh heard me talking about, in a very animated way, talking about the potential for circular economy solutions in market. This is where I was sort of coming from with that. Though the value of that market goes to the local community, the organic waste from that local community gets separated from other forms of waste, finds its way back into a recycling station with composting and other sort of treatment options. The outputs of that then find its way into the different forms of production. So again, trying to think about this as a connected peri-urban system. So hopefully you can see there, the next time someone says to you, you can't do NBS in a big city, or my place is different, hopefully now you've got some examples where you can say, well, your place is different, but whether or not you're in the heart of the city, the peri-urban area around the outside of that big city, you're in a regional space, the flexibility of NBS means that it can be part of a broader green-grey and community-based solution. And then the last question, the phase that we're moving into now is scaling up. So we've spent the last few months the team have sort of gone out, reconnecting with our colleagues in country, saying, right, well, we've finished the case studies. How do we implement these case studies? How do we use the learning from the case study to identify the barriers to upscaling? And then how do we start that work through an agreed strategy? And that strategy is being developed with the national ministries, with the municipalities, with institutes, with NGOs, And we're trying to bring in more and more of the private sector, because we can't build a pilot that is maintainable unless we have the people, the local people that are building it, also involved in the process. Okay, so just about there. So, and I guess just to give you some comfort that when I talk about this sort of stuff, it is evidence-based. So a lot of the work about upscaling is based on a 10-year research program that came out of the Cooperative Research Centre program in Australia. It was 9 years, $120 million. So it was a significant investment looking at how do we integrate NBS in a way that is scalable. And I guess because what we also see, as illustrated by the diagram down the bottom here, the transition to a new way of working, a new business as usual, is really hard. Lots can go wrong and lots does go wrong. And so how do we, what do we need to think about at each step of that process to be able to make our transition a successful one? And the process that we've been going through has been looking at the whole urban system. Okay, and when I say that, I'm meaning, do we have good alignment at a political and a community level about what the vision for the area is? Do we have the laws in place that actually enable and support? So the vision says what we should do, the laws say what we must do. And are there barriers in the laws that are stopping us? Because in some of the countries that I've been talking about today, there are. Secondly, do we have the capacity to compare big grey infrastructure and networks of NBS in a comparable way over long term? So that's already an issue that's come up today. Do we have the technical capacity to implement it and maintain it? And do we have the financial capacity to be able to fund the maintenance and the construction over the life of the asset? And I'm sure you've seen similar many examples of something going really well and having lots of vision and lots of enabling policy, but then nothing happens because they can't get approval, they can't get the economic case up, or they go to piloting stage and they build it and no one maintains it and nothing happens, and so it just becomes a pilot, not a scalable activity. So where we are in a process now is that we've gone through and done an initial assessment of where are the strengths and where are the weaknesses in terms of these key enabling factors, but also the softer things that are needed to facilitate the change. So do you have the champions that you need? Are those champions connected? Do you have the local knowledge that you need to be able to prove that what works in another place will work here? Is that knowledge being codified and locked in to regulations, codes, and tools? So, and this is just a little example of the preliminary outputs for Thailand. But basically what we heard for there was to say they have good vision, they have good policy. Where they're looking for support now is in the implementation side of things. And how do we codify some of the knowledge that is being developed into tools and guidelines? And how do we do that in a way so that the first version of the guideline might be based on international expertise, but there's a research program attached to it so that version 2 is actually driven by local research and local data. So this process is happening in Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And that will really sort of set the roadmap for us as a program, but also the people we have the privilege of working with, so that together we can take what is some really good concepts and some demonstration of concepts and start to scale them up in a way that is business as usual for the centre of the city, for the peri-urban area, and for secondary cities that have really important cultural values. Thanks very much. Happy to take any questions if we have time. Yep. Good. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll ask a question on behalf of the whiteboard, which is, you mentioned there about scale and doing NBS in an urban area at different scales. How do you bring down costs at the same time as scaling up? And is that possible?
Yeah, great. So I think there's quite a bit in that. I think the first one is to build it right in the first place, and to think about the life cycle costs of this. And I guess build, particularly if this is a new and innovative thing, try and build it in a way that facilitates learning and is safe. So, you know, so for example, in one of the countries that we're working in, the codes do not allow construction of NBS. We can't break the curb to passively irrigate trees, for example. So we're doing pilot projects that will take place in universities, in a place that is safe, that in a place that facilitates learning, that in a place that collects really good data to help us influence the code. So the code is changed. They are built in a way that sets them up for success and in a way that minimises the life cycle cost of those particular assets. Once, and I guess it's also trying to be done in a way that builds momentum and support and fosters local private sector, because once you've got local businesses understanding and providing these services, you can start to get to an efficient scale. And then when you've got scale, you get the economies that come with that, and over time costs come down. So so thank you for the question, Whiteboard and Eric. Anything else? Yeah.
On the example of the wastelands, were they, maybe I missed it, were they owned by the government?
Yeah, they were.
They were owned.
Yeah.
And so did you ever experience, even if they were owned by the government, for instance, that they were just much happier to keep them as they are? Because maybe you're reserving them, you know, the thinking might be you're kind of reserving them for when you can build something on them, and then making them productive will make it socially unacceptable to build something on them. And at the same time, you have so much effort to do something on them when you can just, you know, just keep it as is, no cost, no effort, no planning, nothing. Does that come up in the dialogues and conversation?
Yeah, it's possible. And there are also people using it informally. So there were people growing some vegetables, for example, using it. There were people actually, when it was a waste system, going through and sifting through the waste and finding resources that could then be sold. So they need to be, you know, some of the people that live around the area are also former BMA employees. So they were involved in the actual development of the project. But I think maybe that's something that we also need to be thinking more deeply about, is how do we understand the impacts of this on the people that are using the land already, and think about, can they be first and foremost in income generation opportunities for the higher values that can be unlocked by the development of the work. I mean, also too, I'm hoping that this will play a role in improving the amenity of the area. So it'll be cooler, it'll be healthier. You know, it'll hopefully protect a buffer zone between some of the houses that are there and the composting facility that's on the other side of the park. So yeah, so all of that is part of making sure that you understand. Yesterday we talked about the dangers of a cookie cutter approach, rather than actually understanding the context and the people that are going to be impacted by it. So, you know, how do we make sure we understand those impacts and empower the people that are going to feel those impacts in what happens next? Yeah, please.
Thank you for the presentation. I just want to understand, because of course our topic here is the NBS solutions. So we are emphasizing the NBS concept a lot. For me, as a Chinese and also working in the PRC mostly, environmental protection, ecological restoration is almost like a common knowledge, common practice in China. And the government is quite, you know, on board for this NBS solutions. So of course, I understand that we need highways, subways, you know, we need the green infrastructures, and also we need the forests, the lakes, the rivers, etc. So I just want to understand, what's your experience working in other countries? How difficult or how easy for you to work with the other governments, like in your case studies in Vietnam, in Cambodia or Thailand? Are they also open to accept the NBS, or are they, you know, quite difficult for them to accept?
Yeah, I think people are the same all over the world. Some people love innovation, and some people are less welcoming of it. But I think everyone is getting increasingly clear on the challenges that our urban areas are facing, and the gap between the money that we have and the level of traditional infrastructure that will be needed to be able to respond to those. And so I actually sort of see a significant willingness now for people to say, well, how do we make the most of what we have, both in terms of the funding that is available, the infrastructure that is there, and the communities and the history that we have, so that we can sort of better respond to the challenges that we're already starting to feel. And I guess from an Australian point of view, it's a big country. We have tropical areas in the north, deserts in the middle, and cold areas in the south. So normally when I go and talk to someone in the world, they've got a climate that is similar to some part of my home. You can normally sort of understand some of the similar hydrological challenges and some of the opportunities. But I also think there is very significant power in demonstration. So the Kunshan example I mentioned yesterday, that's been declared a national ecological city and a national sponge city demonstration city. So there it's been integrated into all different types of urban infrastructure. So when we talk to other parts of the PRC, we can say, if you've got a rail project, this is what you could do. If you've got a road project, this is what you could do. If you're thinking about the urban parks and the heat within your city, here's some opportunities.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, and it's a really important question. The last thing I'd add is the best way to have a conversation is start by listening, because people that live there know they're a foreigner, and so quite often I skipped over it, but in the slides about the scaling strategy, it's a combination of case study working together on a particular place, local insights and expertise, some international ideas, coming up with a strategy that reflects all of those things. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben.
Sure. Okay. Thanks very much.
Lyndon?
Are you pulling up the next one, or okay. I think I can. Okay, great. I'm going to time myself. I think we're a little behind our time, so I'm going to go a little faster than planned. But please ask questions if I kind of glaze over anything or go over it too quickly. So I'm going to present some urban NBS for stormwater management in the US. So I think Ben provided some great context that I can kind of continue on from that and just dive right in. So first, I'm going to do a little bit more of a deep dive on the city of Philadelphia and look at the citywide Green City Clean Waters program and talk about that kind of program development over time. And it's about halfway through the 25-year life cycle and just some highlights coming out of that program now that it's been established. And then quickly just run through some other cities, some of which are in different kind of climates within the US, and focus on different co-benefits. So we'll see, one of them looking at how do you do urban NBS to reduce flood risk, another one looking at groundwater recharge, and the third one looking at aquatic habitat improvements. So just to provide a little background on Philadelphia, it's a large city by US standards. It's about 1.6 million people, the sixth largest city in the US. The metro region is about 6 million. And it's part of the Delaware River watershed. So Brooke presented a slide yesterday that showed New York City accessing water. It actually gets it from an interbasin transfer. So it gets it from the Delaware River watershed in the headwaters. So the watershed itself provides drinking water for over 15 million people because, some of it is going to New York City. And Philadelphia is a historic city by US standards. So it has a lot of infrastructure, including its drinking water system that in some parts is over 200 years old. So they're still, when they're replacing pipes, they still dig up wooden pipes from the 1800s in parts of the city. It has a pretty high poverty rate for US standards. It has the moniker as the poorest big city in the US. So for that reason, kind of point out that the program, part of the reason the program came about was justification for, it was lower cost than traditional gray infrastructure approaches, which was, they didn't want to overly overburden residents of the city who a lot of whom are in poverty. It also has an inequitable distribution of parks and green space due to historic discriminatory practices. So a lot of minority communities don't have the same access to green space as other communities in the city. And just thinking about it in terms of climate conditions, it's in the Northeast US. So some key impacts that this region is seeing as a result of climate change are increasing temperatures and increasing precipitation and intensity, duration, and frequency. So real quick, just kind of some nice graphic slides to provide a primer. Some of the outdated infrastructure in the city is its combined sewer system. So during dry weather, you can see, the wastewater comes from homes and industry, and it goes directly to the treatment plant. In wet weather situations, if there's enough rain, the combined stormwater and wastewater will actually overflow into local waterways, causing water quality and challenges and health concerns. So the city really is seen as a pioneer in terms of implementing green tools to manage stormwater. So green tools is just another way to say urban NBS, or green stormwater infrastructure is the local term. So really to capture and detain rainwater at its source so that it prevents as many overflows into the river. And so the Philadelphia Water Department developed the Green City Clean Waters Plan, which was published in 2011 to meet federal and state water quality standards that are mandated by the government. And so in doing so, they prioritized a green rather than gray approach. There are some, wastewater treatment plan and other gray upgrades that are integrated into this plan, but really it's primarily focused on how to do distributed green infrastructure throughout the city at the scale necessary to have impacts in improving water quality and meet those federal standards. So it's kind of a wonky term, but it's their delivery of those assets are in the form of greened acres, which is just a way of measuring how much volume of stormwater is being managed by green infrastructure throughout the city. And so you can see this kind of 25-year time horizon and those delivery targets that they have to meet for environmental regulators. These are just some of the green tools. I think, Ben spoke well to like the scaling up, scaling down of different urban NBS solutions. So these are some of the, ones that are kind of go-tos within the city, like to fit into really dense urban environments. You can see there's rain gardens, stormwater bump outs, forest pavements, tree trenches, green gutters, and rain barrels and cisterns. Also green roofs, there's other ones as well. These are some of the ones I'd say that are kind of most common practices. And so it's creating a menu of options. Again, it's not necessarily a cookie cutter approach. They're adapted to specific sites throughout the city. So you have to fit local context. And these photos give an example. It's both on public land in terms of parks and along the right of way, but also on private commercial sites, public or school sites, and faith-based institutions. So in terms of delivery of the green acres, over the course of the program to date, which has been about 12 years, you can see it's really distributed in terms of how it's getting implemented. So these are the three main project pipelines. So there's private development. The city has regulations that require redevelopment or new development if they're exceeding a certain limit of disturbance to do green infrastructure on site according to those regulations. Also public retrofits. So the water department working with other city agencies like streets, parks and recreation will do a lot of work in the public right of way. And then finally incentivize retrofits for private landowners through grants or reduction in stormwater fees to actually get private landowners to partake in the program as well. And you get additional benefits if you're able to capture stormwater from the public right of way and filter it onto your site. So this is just a snapshot. The water department makes a lot of this data publicly available to see, it's showing the combined sewer area, which is about 60% of the city, and just how many kind of green tools, quote unquote, have been installed over the lifetime of the program, which now exceeds 3,000 at almost, it's probably about 900 sites by now, and I know it exceeds 3 billion gallons of reduced CSOs per year, or water managed annually. All right, in the interest of time, I'm just going to keep going. So I'll say, you know, we talk about co-benefits, and I'm going to show some projects that really highlight different ways to think about maximizing certain co-benefits. One of the reasons that kind of this program, in addition to the cost effectiveness and that it would immediately start delivering assets versus a large gray infrastructure approach, which would, you know, take about 20 years to construct and be really disruptive to different areas of the city, was about, you know, how it prioritizes co-benefits and achieves what the city calls triple bottom line, so environmental, economic, and social benefits. So not only is it improving water quality by delivery of these green tools, it's also improving air quality, reducing carbon emissions, creating wildlife habitat, some of the economic benefits, creating local jobs. The Sustainable Business Network is a local nonprofit that actually seeks to measure some of that stuff. And they put out a report after 10 years of the program that shows over 1,000 jobs are created as a result of the Green City Clean Waters program, a lot of which are local and small businesses. And they also create easier entry points into the jobs than traditional gray infrastructure that require higher level degrees. So it's creating opportunities for people who wouldn't necessarily be able to access jobs through alternative or traditional approaches. You know, increasing property values, I'm just picking out a few here, saving on energy costs. And then some of the social benefits, really looking at those climate resiliency aspects, so reduced urban heat, reduced flood risk. So these are things that are often kind of touted and were a rationale for the city putting this program forward in the first place. I'll say one of the challenges that I've heard from folks at the Philadelphia Water Department and other water utilities in terms of scaling up urban NBS in their programs is, okay, it's great, we can say they provide these co-benefits, but we need to actually be able to measure and quantify them. So one of the projects that I've been working on with some water resource economists over the past few years is, okay, how do we actually measure the co-benefits of these practices in a way that, you know, is presentable in a benefit cost analysis and can provide a tool to water utilities across the US in saying, you know, in the early planning stages of projects to say, if we implement this project, you know, what are the expected costs and benefits over time, so that they can bring this to key decision makers like finance officers or other city leaders to say, look at this case making we can do for this green approach. And I have a few more slides on this tomorrow, and I think it's a good intro to the next session that Ben and Eric will be speaking to. This is not advancing. Sorry if I clicked on something. I'm going to keep it to 15. So this is pretty close to Philadelphia. It's in Wilmington, Delaware. So similar kind of climate conditions. This is an example of where urban NBS was implemented specifically to reduce flooding in an adjacent neighborhood, the neighborhood of Southbridge, which is an underserved community. You know, we heard stories from residents of that community that every time it rained, they weren't able to sleep because their basements would flood. So it had real day-to-day impacts, flooding in that area. So this was it's a 20 acre, so I did the math, it's about 8-hectare park, wetland park, restored former tidal wetlands into this asset that really was intended, the main intention was to reduce flooding in Southbridge. In addition to creating this green asset, it was paired with some gray infrastructure improvements. So the combined sewer system in that neighborhood was separated so that stormwater could flow directly into this wetland park. And it also, there was former brownfield. So part of the project was remediating contaminated soils on site. And it also improved recreation and access across the park to new development, including like grocery stores for a neighborhood that didn't have walkable access. So this is just showing, before construction, how the neighborhood would see flooding during peak flood events, and then just some of the conceptual plans that were done. And so, the city of Wilmington was the lead for this project, but key nonprofit partners like the Nature Conservancy helped with the next example is from Tucson, Arizona, which is in the southwest of the US. It's a more arid Tucson Water in 1996. So a long time ago, and I'll say Tucson Water is really ahead of the pack in terms of thinking about sustainable water resources in the Southwest US. So really thinking about kind of water reuse. And this project was created to, it's a Sweetwater Wetlands is the name of the project, creating a stormwater wetlands specifically to treat effluent from wastewater treatment and recharge the aquifer. Some of the co-benefits of that are that it creates this incredible wildlife habitat, as well as recreational amenities. I was fortunate to actually get to visit this site as part of a conference last year, and I'm just showing a couple photos of the wildlife I saw on site. There was a desert tortoise and a great horned owl. And one of the key aspects too is this green space is accessible via active transportation. So there's a bike trail that connects to downtown that was being actively used. So that was another consideration. Real quick, the last kind of case study is the Aurora Bridge bioswales in Seattle. Seattle's located in Washington, which I presented on yesterday. Yeah, Brooks from Seattle. So, and this project, it actually stemmed from a private developer. You can see the kind of the new buildings to the right of this bridge here. And this developer was really interested in sustainable building practices and thinking about, how do they manage the stormwater that's falling in or around the site. So, and one key thing I'll say is that there was recent research in Seattle around salmon. And one of the findings was that some of the materials that's used in tires are actually toxic to salmon populations. So this is an interstate bridge, so it's owned by the state Department of Transportation, and it was being discharged directly into a nearby lake, Lake Union, where salmon kind of pass through. So the green practices that were implemented here are specifically to filter out those toxins to improve the aquatic habitat for salmon species. Obviously, there's additional co-benefits. It creates green space under, what was formerly an underutilized site. You can see this bridge here and just how the water flows off and is captured. One of the things to point out about this project is just there were a lot of regulatory challenges because the state owns the bridge. The outfalls are actually owned by the city. The state owns the land, anyway, there's a lot of components, and then it's filtering onto private land. So there was a lot of working through some of the, not only the technical aspects, but also just like the regulatory aspects in order to get the project in place. But it's a great pilot to show, what's possible via a public-private partnership. And hopefully we'll unlock more projects like this in Seattle and around. So I will stop there. I think I caught us up a little bit. And I don't know if we have time for questions.
Thanks, Lyndon, and also Ben. Those two presentations are full of really great ideas. And just a question that I was going to ask you, but equally applicable to this one. How creative do you have to be when you set about trying to quantify the benefits of these kind of, urban park schemes? And how difficult is it to stack them up against, let's say, a proposal for a shopping mall or a high-rise luxury apartment condo?
I guess just a question if that will be addressed in the next session or if, okay. I guess to the first part of your question, how creative, I'll just speak to the project that I mentioned, which is the GSI Impact Hub, which is really about, it's right now, it's just in the US and Canada, but how do you measure the co-benefits of these projects? And so, you know, in that project, we're really looking to all of the research that's been done. Like that was a key part of it, was a literature review to actually understand throughout those geographies what research is in place in terms of like specific co-benefits that are part of that analysis. So, you know, it has a broad range in terms of like carbon emissions reductions, green space and recreational tourism benefits, but also property value benefits. So it's drawing on, you know, all of that literature and research, and also thinking about it in a specific geography, since certain co-benefits, you know, might depend on what your climatic conditions are, or how valuable, for example, like urban heat reduction would be in one geography versus another. I hope I didn't sidestep your question too much. Ben, do you have anything to add to, I guess, to the second part of the question, was kind of comparing it to a mall, or, you know, what other forms of development that might go in?
I think it's a good answer. Just to add, there's an increasing body of work and research and experience that will help come up with a first estimate. And I think the quality of the estimate needs to be fit for purpose. So if you're just doing an initial screen to go from a whole bunch of a long list of a whole bunch of options to something that's shorter, then maybe something that is reasonably indicative is okay, as long as you're doing sensitivity testing. You know, and you'll hear from Eric and I later, benefit cost analysis is not a black box. If you're just thinking about a number that comes out of it, you're not getting value out of the process. And so what the process with the benefit cost process will do, if it's done well, will help you understand what are the key costs and what are the key benefits, and what assumptions matter in terms of the result. And that will tell you, as you go from your initial screen to something that is more sophisticated, where you need to put your time and effort into going from a creative estimate to something that is much more defensible, because it's important to making a good decision. Yeah.
Is there another?
Yeah, thank you for these two presentations. Very good. I think very interesting, and just trying to think how we can apply for that, you know, best practices into our real world operations, because that's the center of our core business. You know, we process like a $20 billion. Yeah, that's the water and urban project of this bank. And then some of them, we do have element of nature-based solutions. And but then because of the, you know, the area that we cover, we have many projects like water supply, sanitation, urban transport, air pollution, etc. So, but then the nature-based solution itself is not really a core theme of the loan that we do. It's more like a subset. I mean, when we have green urban space development as one of the components, then we try to put the nature-based solution as part of the scope. So that's the approach that we are taking, because the government, in most cases, they are not convinced to borrow from us to do just for the nature-based solution. So I hope this is okay. So that's maybe one comment. I think when you have many good practices in Philadelphia, Delaware, Australia, we want to bring our client to any of those places. I mean, those slides are wonderful, right? Because I'm so impressed with what's happening. But we want to bring them to your city, because, as I said, the seeing is believing. And then we do that for water supply, sanitation. For instance, we bring client from our member country, and then make them understand the concept of the water supply operations. And then in the afternoon, we actually go to see the plant. And then I hope maybe the US cities can do that for us, inviting our client to come to your cities and make them see how we can connect between our client and your cities. So maybe this is actually happening, right? Japan is doing it, Australia is doing it, Philippines is doing. and then so are the others. So that's the application of the concept is super important to us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I really appreciate those comments and ideas. And I'd say even, not only kind of international like learning around this, and I totally agree that seeing is believing, and it's, it's one thing to hear about it and it's another thing to see it. Even at the local scale, I'm involved in implementation of projects in Philadelphia. We also bring, community members from one neighborhood to another to see, when we're talking about this, we do site visits to say, look at how it's been applied in other areas. And oftentimes, the focus is around what co-benefits it provides to the community. And the water department's paying for it because it's meeting their regulatory obligations, but we're really providing, an asset to the community that's also meeting, their priorities. And one thing I'll just mention, because I did gloss over in the interest of time, just to kind of re-emphasize here, is just that these are assets that will increase in term, the water department has actually seen these. They were conservative in their estimates of how much stormwater was being managed. So they actually were only accounting for retention on site and not infiltration or evapotranspiration. So it's actually managing 1.3 times the amount of stormwater as they were at first kind of calculating. So I'd say it's just, kind of speaks to that these are assets that kind of grow in value. And that was a point that Brooke was making too with the South Africa case study.
I'll just put a plug that TNC does these types of learning exchanges all the time. So if you are interested in coming to see a variety of projects, we'd be very happy to chat with you about it. I'm sure Monash does the same. I'm sure you'd be happy to have them come to Australia.
A few very quick points. I think as well as coming and seeing countries like the States and Australia, I think it's really important that we promote regional learning and sharing. So how do we go from creative estimates to ones that are informed by local knowledge, leveraging practices that have probably been continue to happen for a long, long time, even centuries. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is, yes, sure, come to Australia for the first visit, but next time let's go to one of the local countries and foster people sharing ideas amongst those countries. The last point really quickly, I think it's great that you're building NBS into loans, because that's kind of what mainstreaming looks like. As long as we're dependent on it being a separately funded activity, it's not mainstreamed. So the more that we can do to get these sorts of ideas integrated into good infrastructure investments and good urban planning, the more it'll become part of day-to-day, and the better we'll get in terms of that good balance of green and grey.
No, what I'm thinking, I mean, what my colleague said, I was thinking that, yeah, it's true that the government, it's not very easy to convince government to have a full NBS projects, it's true. And we have a number of urban and water sector projects that are subset, a few components or a tiny amount are dedicated for the NBS. But when I was looking at the three presentations, so usually how urban and water projects are being implemented in ADV. Let's say we have a PMU, project management unit, and then we have a PIU, project implementation unit and project management unit. So usually the project implementation unit means that municipality mayor headed by mayor, and at the PMU level, there is like a LGED, I mean, the local government engineering department or divisions. And this PMU is supported by number of the consulting firm, like the project management consultant supervisions firm. And also we have a design development consulting firm. So when we go for a implementation of a sub projects in a municipality, so designs comes from the, we call DDC, design consultant. So if the design consulting firm, like now we have in every consulting firm, we put climate change expert. If there is a one NBS expert, we can put it. So in each and every component, he can touch upon this, all the NBS things. I mean, it's like a final touch. We are doing everything, But if there is a NBS consultant, an expert, so in each component, he can touch upon what things need to be bring within these sub projects. Then ultimately go for the advertisement, and the contractor will bound to do this. I mean, this is the way to also think about the NBS, that how we can implement it with the ongoing projects. Just to have to do the revision of our TOR of the DDS, I mean design development consultant. Because to doing these things, we don't need much money. Within this money, we can do it. Just we have to think out of the box. We have to think in a different way. I'm not sure if does it make sense.
Yeah, that makes good sense. And so we have language that you can kind of use to plug and play into existing terms of reference to kind of expand the consultant's remit to look into nature-based solutions. And so we can help kind of provide some of those guardrails and kind of nudges and specific language to help them do that, and kind of pull out more of those NBS options that you can look through and kind of choose from for your project.
I really like the way that you talked about the issue of achieving a successful project, starting at the top from the most senior person and the person who's going to authorize the funding and the capacity to do the project, either at a national, municipal or organizational level, and then going down and saying, well, who is the technical expert that is going to make way? With these sorts of projects, it's a little bit like doing a zip up on a jacket. You know, you start at the bottom and you zip it all the way up, and everything's got to connect, because if you have a failure at one of those stages, then the project's not going to be successful. So I think one of the things that we talk about is, how do you make sure before you start the project that you've thought about each level, and what's your strategy to make sure you've got the support that you need to be able to do the work in a good way.
Yeah, and I'll just emphasize too that kind of body of research that I highlighted is really getting at that aspect, you know, from practitioners and engineers. Like, they're not concerned with the technical designs, like they know that can be achieved. Is how do you make the case up the flagpole, or do that zipper up to say, you know, what's actually going to change the minds? And, you know, often it is that economic case making. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks very much for all the case studies. So my question is shifting gears a bit. It's on, I think these were, or some of them were constructed wetlands. Did I get that right?
Yes.
So are they, so my question is in constructed wetlands as an NBS, do they get cited on what would have been wetland spaces? They don't look like they were former wetland. I mean, is there like a practice like that where you should, you know, how where they consider mangroves, they do try as best practice to make sure this was a mangrove area and these were the species of mangroves that belong there. So for the constructed wetlands, is it the same, or is it just a matter of like replicating a wetland function?
Well, no, so I'll speak to this one. This was, you know, a former tidal wetland, so it was restored. You know, aspects of it, you know, were previously used for industry too. So in that case, you know, it was reconstructed, but the site was an area where, you know, there was some existing, but had been a much larger tidal wetland. So it was a restoration project and considered kind of what the context was there before development as well. Brooke, you seem like you have something to add.
Ideally, yes. If you're constructing a wetland, there should have been something similar there before it was filled in. I will say in our Dominican Republic work in Yaque del Norte, there was not a wetland where they've previously now created a wetland, but this wetland's a little bit different. So it has like a gravel pit on the top, and it's not made for like biodiversity. It's made to filter the water in these dispersed towns that don't have access to water treatment plants, and probably will not for, you know, decades to come. The biodiversity benefit that results from that created wetland is the quality of the water that then is discharged directly into the river system that houses all of their freshwater and aquatic biodiversity. So like there wasn't a wetland there beforehand, but they're kind of using the concept of a wetland to filter that water underground before it heads out to the river.
To that then, is there, let's say, residual effects of putting a wetland where a wetland wasn't there? Were there like positive or negative effects, or is that even being monitored?
Yeah, in the case of Yake, it doesn't. I can show you a picture of what it looks like. It does not look like a wetland. There's no active like water body at the surface. It's really about permeability. And then they kind of have a created wetland below surface that then discharges the water that's been filtered. So there hasn't been any residual downsides to the created wetlands. In fact, the communities are really looking to like scale that as a distributed way to improve the water quality that then is being discharged into the river system. Okay, I think that we are going to cap it at that for right now. We are going to give you a 10-minute break. So please come back at 11:25 for the ROI session and put your thinking caps on because it will be, I think, a little bit dense.
And there will be lots of questions. So just like yesterday.
あ、そうですか。いいですね。そういう、それをやると、どっかで、そうなんですね。Mooncake. I love it. Big mooncake.
Thank you for
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Oh,
And also to answer your question yesterday, you
Yes.
asked us what are the main challenges incorporating NBS in the project's design.
Yes.
My answer is in practice, most in many cases I found that land resource is a constraint. Because NBS very often requires a lot of land resources, like green spaces, parks, wetland restoration. So whether the government decide to use the land for some economic benefits, like for agricultural purpose, or for NBS project, like very often state.
In fact, I see that women on this project. For now.
Sure. But we had most of the discussions yesterday already.
Okay, maybe we work together.
Now you last. Yeah, it's my last step, so
Okay, thank you. Okay, anyone still outside? 30 seconds. I think we're still waiting on a couple of the project leads. Return on investment, ROI. We will find out in this session. Okay, thanks very much everyone again for being here and for the fantastic questions and discussion this morning. We're about half an hour over time, but thankfully we were supposed to have a half an hour office hour from 12 to 12:30. So what we're going to do is continue on to have this session for a full hour and run until 12:30. So we'll have time at the end of the session for questions. So any office hour related kind of questions we'll deal with as part of this session as well. Great question from the front. ROI means return on investment. Ben and I will be running this session to explain some of the ways that you can assess the costs and benefits of these nature-based solutions programs. We hope to answer some of the questions that were raised yesterday around project bankability, motivating stakeholders and prioritizing between different types of benefits. Economic analysis is one of the ways to deliver those objectives. It's not the only way, but it's often important, particularly when you're talking about loans. So I'll start with a brief what and why of cost benefit analysis and return on investment, which are similar but different things. And it's worth highlighting why those are different. I'll give an example of return on investment for Cape Town, which was the case study Brooke gave us earlier. So you'll see a couple of the same charts in there as well. Cape Town is a great example for this because it's a relatively straightforward case with one major thing they're trying to achieve, which is water quantity, and one key practice, which is controlling these invasive plants. So that's kind of a relatively simple example to give. We'll give you a quick explainer of a tool we have called Waterproof, which is an online hydrologic modeling platform, to give a cost-benefit analysis case from Ruckus and explain the Infuse tool, which Monash has developed. Then we'll come back for 5 minutes at the end for a recap and kind of Q&A. Starting with cost-benefit analysis and return on investment. The first question to the group, what do these terms mean to you, those of you that have heard of them before? You're going to need to say that into a mic.
One of the bases to make the project successful or running. Yeah.
Perfect. Totally agreed. Speaking as an economist, I think it's the most important, but other people maybe have different perspectives, but agreed, it's a totally critical piece of motivating people and of identifying what we're going to do in these projects. So one of the important things I think to highlight at the beginning, these terms cost-benefit analysis and return on investment, they mean slightly different things. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but they're actually different. And the one that we choose can be really important. So starting with return on investment, this is probably the thing you're most familiar with as a group here. This is when we're thinking about tangible financial benefits. So how do I compare my costs and how do I compare my benefits for a specific project? And how do those materialize over time? And who are those costs and benefits accruing to? This is really useful defining returns for a specific audience. When we think about IRR, that's return on investment. Cost benefit analysis is more broad than that. We might be thinking about things which are harder to quantify, like benefits to the local community. We might be thinking about land value capture. We might be thinking about green jobs, for example. This is helpful for exploring the broader rationale for a project, including things which are harder to quantify or maybe which we aren't able to attach financial flows to, things like carbon sequestration if there's no credit scheme, or mitigation of flooding, for example, can also be hard to quantify sometimes. So helpful to think about return on investment as a specific return to an audience, and cost benefit analysis as a broader kind of perspective. The Cape Town example I'll give is return on investment. That's more specific. And then when Ben comes in, he'll give us a broader cost benefit analysis view. I'm just going to set a timer on my phone to make sure we don't go over. Okay. So what are the key questions we might want to answer with a cost benefit analysis? I gave some of these at the top, but any ideas from the group? You're trying to identify returns, you're trying to explore the rationale for a project. What are the questions you might try to answer with those analyses?
Put in $1, how much do I get back?
Okay, great answer from the front. That's, if I put in $1, how much do I get back? So here we have a list of some other options. So cost effectiveness, which projects should I be doing and where? And how might those compare to alternatives? So the example Brooke gave earlier with Cape Town, which will be the example I'll give. How does clearing these invasive plants compare to desalination or groundwater extraction? How do these costs and benefits arrive, and to whom? Ben mentioned this earlier with the urban NBS case. This also relates to some of the questions we got yesterday on motivating different stakeholders. Some stakeholders receive costs, some receive benefits, some receive both. And the quantities of those costs and benefits also differ by stakeholder. A portfolio of NBS can also be analyzed with cost benefit analysis. So do we want to do farming practices, or do we want to do repairing corridor restoration? Or maybe we want to do both. And how do those things interact and interfere with each other? There are some other things there as well. So there are many questions we can answer with these kind of analyses. And these are really important questions to ask ourselves. They help us determine our strategy. They help us justify what we're doing, both internally within the bank, but also to our clients and other stakeholders. And perhaps if we're thinking about a 3 to 5 year bank upfront, maintaining those natural assets, how do we justify to them that they're going to be kind of picking up after we leave off? Unlocking support from those stakeholders and motivating funding, of course. Policy is also important. If you remember back to yesterday, the example I gave of Camboriú in Brazil, one of the things which had to happen there was an adjustment to the water tariff scheme, which allowed the utility to invest in activities outside of its urban area. And the analysis here, the return on investment assessment, was necessary to allow that to actually happen. One thing which is key about these economic analyses is that they have to happen alongside the biophysical. So someone can cook up the most, we've seen some very exciting Excel models in the different analyses we've done, but this has to be talking to what the scientists are doing. It has to be talking to the ecologists, it has to be talking to the hydrologists and the climate modelers too. We spoke yesterday about a broad range of voices and experts needed for these programs, just like if you're designing traditional infrastructure, and it's key to design these analyses with a purpose. You may have heard the term analysis paralysis, which is one I like. That can really happen when you think, okay, which nature-based solutions am I going to do? There are so many questions there to consider, and it can be intimidating and difficult to kind of get started. It's really key to begin with who cares about this project? What do they care about? And the third bullet point there is about burden of proof. So I want to convince local municipality, what do they care about? And how can I answer that question through the analysis that I'm doing? So we touched, and it was mentioned earlier, stakeholders and how to convince them. I think building the things that we think stakeholders need to see into the analysis up front, rather than as an attachment at the end, is really key as well. And we'll see some examples as how that was done. And this is a common mistake, thinking about NBS as individual projects here and there rather than as a combined system of assets, which Ben and Lyndon both mentioned earlier. So we'll give an example from Cape Town now. So here are 7 different steps, which you don't have to memorize, but we'll run through them all in sequence, starting determining beneficiaries, connecting ecosystem services to interventions, and all the way through to our financial indicators at the end. That's where we get to our ROI and IRR numbers. So another question to the group. Based on what you heard earlier today about the case study from Cape Town Brooke gave us, what do we think and who are the main beneficiaries of the program and what are their interests? We have Water Authority. Water Authority is correct. Thank you. So we have residents of Cape Town, spot on. Both of those are true. So I think in this case, the Water Authority under the city, managing that. We have the regional government as well, kind of as managers of the infrastructure assets, but also as representatives of the community. We have private businesses like Coca-Cola who rely on that water. And we have Cape Nature and other local NGOs who are doing this kind of activity. And water scarcity, as we touched on, is the kind of main challenge. Primary ROI metric, yield to the water supply system. So Brooke mentioned this earlier. This is a kind of straightforward case of we've had a really severe water crisis and there's one key metric which everybody cares about. But there are co-benefits too, sustainable livelihoods, mentioned there with the community again. Gender empowerment, which Brooke mentioned there, we saw in the video, and biodiversity outcomes as well. This key fynbos habitat, unique in the world, being destroyed by these invasive plants. It's very common not to properly think about beneficiaries. Great to involve folks as early as possible, even if they're going to be involved passively. If these key decision makers think that analysis has been cooked up and then presented to them, it's much less convincing than if they've been involved and kind of consulted throughout, even if it's been done in a passive way. That's something we've seen in several situations. So our priority interventions are this clearing of invasive alien plants. And how do we identify where to do that? So looking on the left there, this is the invasion level of these different plants. So in the darkest red, these are the areas of that map where the invasive plants are most present. And on the right, we have person day cost. So based on different features of the landscape, it costs different amounts to go and do invasive control in different areas. So on the left, we have potential impact, and on the right, we have potential cost. So I'll try and ask another question, which is, based on the video we saw earlier, what do we think might be the different factors that influence cost being different in these different areas? Okay. Terrain, perfect. So some of these areas are very steep and the technicians have to go up there with ropes. They have to take chainsaws or hand saws. They have to rappel down. The saws aren't so expensive, but what is expensive is the time, the extra time it takes for people to climb all the way up and then rappel down. Similarly, as Brooke mentioned earlier with the helicopter example, some of these places are hard to reach than others. And maybe there aren't access roads. And actually the time it takes to get there and set up camp can really eat into the team's time. So it's important to think about impact, but cost at the same time. Risk, risk also, as in person risk or? Yes, absolutely, yeah. Okay, so here we have our scenarios. Brooke showed these up earlier. So in the blue kind of full line at the bottom, that's our investment plan. That's what's delivered by the chart we saw with Brooke earlier with the costs. This red line is our do nothing. Green is our business as usual, and the dashed 3 is current status. That's current status of the program. So it's important here we have a combination of, okay, we think we're going to do these things in these different areas, And this is what we think the impact will be based on what we saw before about the invasion. What's interesting in the case of invasive plant control is that when you remove some invasive plants, you're also removing them from the places they would have been if you hadn't gone back and removed them. In other words, if you don't remove some plants, they spread. So if you remove plants today from 10 hectares, maybe if you hadn't done that in 10 years' time, you'd be talking about 20 or 30 hectares. And that's the kind of analysis that often ecologists and things are needed for. So we need to broaden beyond the economic realm when we're creating that baseline that we're comparing against. It's not necessarily the situation today will be continued forward. And that's often something which is a common mistake, not defining baseline correctly. Particularly speaking as an economist, it's easy to kind of be focused on the context today, but particularly with nature, we need to think long term. So we have this prioritization map. This is a function of the current level of invasion, which we saw before, and the different costs of acting in those different areas. And this is our yield losses. So this is, earlier we saw the invasion. This is what happens to water yield into the dams in each of those scenarios. And we have our program benefits, which is that big green area there. So this is between business as usual and full implementation. This is all the additional water we think we can get into our dams. And this is our benefit from our return on investment. This is the chart we saw with Brooke earlier. So these are our costs, where we have this high impact period at the beginning, where we're scaling up a lot of the work with funding coming from private sector and others, and then a kind of long-term tail of government-funded maintenance going on. And like we said before, lifetime costs. And here's that again in a waterfall diagram. So with these costs and benefits over time, we're able to calculate NPV, benefit cost ratio, and our return on investment. So this is where the financial analysis comes in. And there are various different indicators we can extract from that. On the ROI side, we're talking about IRR, NPV, and different scenarios we saw before. And on the cost effectiveness side, cost over a project's lifetime. So another question from what Brooke gave us earlier, how might we want to communicate these outputs to different stakeholders, and what might we be comparing these numbers against? So we've just done our big analysis, we've got an IRR of this invasive control. What are we comparing that IRR against to convince these stakeholders?
Thank you for coming to our Olympics learning event. Other investment opportunities.
Okay, we have grey infrastructure. And my clicker is busted. Exactly. So grey infrastructure. So here we're seeing invasive alien plant control at the top. That's unit cost in the dark blue and effective yield in the light blue against desalination, water reuse, and then groundwater extraction in two different parts of the catchment. So we can see for a much lower per cubic meter cost, we can get much more yield than these other options. So what we're seeing here with the dark blue line is cost effectiveness. And what we're seeing in the medium or light blue line is opportunity. In other words, not only is nature-based solutions in this case cost effective, it's also important and large enough to actually be meaningful. So we're not just talking about a couple of pilot projects which are cost effective in situ. This is a sustainable large-scale program which can be done in the catchment. I'll give another couple of minutes on waterproof and then hand over to Ben for a case study from Ruckus. So waterproof is a tool that we've developed and is freely available online. We can spend some of our clinic sessions this afternoon going through it if it's of interest. This takes global data sets on things like land cover, land use, and climate, runs a couple of ecosystem benefits models you may have heard of from the Natural Capital Project, Invest and Rios. These are very standard. Use some custom cost functions, and then delivers very high level return on investment numbers. So in one of the sessions yesterday for Bangkok, we discussed identification of areas upstream which might be restored to reduce sediment runoff. This is a model which in 30 minutes can give us some very quick answers on that. There's a few steps in Waterproof Online. You select different NBS. There are some preloaded options within the system, or you can create some new ones with some different parameters. you configure your water intake. So here we have a side intake from a river going through a desander and then to a treatment plant. But with simple dragging and dropping, we can create different scenarios. We define our water treatment infrastructure. This is the template which exists in there, but we can again add or remove different pieces. And then we can analyze our outputs. So we say, I think I want to invest 300,000 USD per year for 5 years into this catchment. And the model can give us a very initial estimate of sediment delivery, phosphorus, nitrogen, and then carbon storage as well. And that leads to an ROI estimate. And this is an example of the output we derive from this model. So this is a watershed model which has been run again with Invest and Rios very quickly. We're seeing their NBS scenario in the top left, the business as usual in the top right, and then the current scenario in the bottom left. So again, very freely, simple tool available online from TNC, water-proof.org. We can run through that in the clinic sessions later on. This is just an example of one very rapid screening tool which can be run. I wouldn't invest $2 billion a year based on waterproof, but what this can do is say, does it seem like it's worth continuing the conversation about nature-based solutions in this catchment? And if so, which ones? And then that unlocks the more detailed analysis and TA. As I mentioned there, yeah, pre-feasibility stage. And please, we're eager to answer questions on waterproof and kind of run through it at a later date. There's also trainings and things available online, which will go into more detail tomorrow. Okay, and I'll hand it over from there to Ben.
Okay, so I'll talk about benefit cost analysis, but from an urban point of view. And because I'm getting old, I've only got 5 steps rather than Eric's 7, but they say the same sorts of things. And I guess I'll use a practical example again from the Ruckus work, this time in Thailand, looking at the city of Rayong, which is at the end of the Eastern Economic Corridor. It's about 2 hours southeast of Bangkok. And to emphasize, just like waterproof, we're at this stage of the analysis, we're not making a decision on whether or not we will make a final decision on hundreds of millions of dollars. We're at the start. We're at the strategic and pre-feasibility stage saying, are these ideas worth further investigation? And if they are, where should we look? Where should we focus in? What are the assumptions that are really driving the costs and the benefits in this particular example relative to either a do nothing or other options? And I guess, as we've said many times over the last couple of days, we start by understanding the context that we're in, the particular issues that we're facing from a social, economic and environmental point of view. In this particular case, we are in the heart of Rayong, an area that is sort of an economic centre, but it is also very grey. In Rayong, they were concerned about flooding. It was flooding very regularly, and the water quality of that flooding was very poor, largely due to a combined system that was not sufficient to deal with the volume of water and waste coming into it. But we quickly also understood that looking at the issues was heat. You can see in the photos here, there is not much green, lots of radiant heat from very high temperatures. So how do we think about Rayong that is, it works well when it's wet, but it also works well and is a good place to be when it's dry and really hot. So the next step in the process was to think, just like with the other examples we talked about today, how do we look at different types of NBS working at different scales as part of a connected network? And you can see in this particular case, we looked at major roads around the outside for some types of NBS. So these were basically looking at the drainage and the water quality and the flooding that was resulting from those major roads. Secondary roads connecting different parts of the city, and also and with those secondary roads, thinking about not just flooding, so putting NBS in there, like bump outs that we heard earlier from Lyndon, rain gardens, green walls, green roofs, areas that help detain water when it's wet, but also provide cooling when it's dry and hot. And also thinking about the destinations, schools, shopping centres, can we get MBS into those places so that people have a really good experience from a flooding and a heat point of view when they leave their front door and they drive to their destination and when they get to their destination. So, and we also looked at the costs and benefits of these things as a package, because sometimes you get network economies, that you actually get more benefits and connected network. But we also looked at them on a standalone basis and started thinking about, well, which ones give us the most return and which ones should we do first? And so just to illustrate some of the examples, we've talked about roads quite a bit over the last couple of days. And in Rayong at the moment, the roads are high in the centre and low on the outside. So when it rains, it floods the area. Water flows into the shops and surrounds. What we're suggesting is instead of flooding out, it floods in. That starts to separate the combined system. So not water and sewage. This is just stormwater from the road that is being collected there. Maybe a bit better quality, potentially use. So creating a resource, capturing a resource when it's wet so that it's available for irrigation when it's very dry. And so we're starting to think about water and sanitation as separate systems over time. So see there, as the water drains in, it improves. So this is actually the photo of one of the main roads. And when we looked at the total costs, you could see that these big main roads were major investments. They were managed by the national ministry. Here, these ones are smaller. The secondary roads are managed by the local municipality. And so we can say, well, there's a big cost there. Can we think about the timing of our different interventions so that we do the smaller secondary roads first in a way, almost like pilots, in a way that is less commitment of cost, less exposure to risk, and opportunities for learning, so that when the big roads are next renewed and remediated, the NBS is integrated into that process of, so part of the upgrade is actually thinking about getting NBS as part of the asset. So we heard earlier the question, is it okay for NBS? Do they need to be standalone or can they be integrated into investments? They can be integrated in investments, but there can also be standalone investments that help us learn so that we get the best of the application. And down here, we're also looking at some quick wins. So again, at this early stage in the MBS, it is providing opportunities for us to think about not only what are we going to do, but the sequencing, and so that we can also use that sequencing as managing risk and ultimately cost. Responding to one of the questions on the board earlier about how do we start to get the costs down. Use your pilots, use your sequencing to be able to build it right in the first place and in a way that manages the future stream of maintenance and renewal costs. The other thing too is that by using this process rather than a black box, but as a way of learning about your costs and benefits, when we estimated the benefits over 20 years, looking at damage costs from floods, looking at the extra amenity that comes from cool places and a refuge when it's really hot and a really good place to be. And even things like savings in air conditioning, potentially. We saw that the green canyons created by the secondary roads had a significantly large benefit, more than the primary roads. So less cost, more benefits. These are the ones that we should probably start with. Then we crunched the numbers, quantified the benefits and quantified the costs over the 20 years. And we identified a range of things. We looked at them, as Eric was saying, first from an ROI point of view, the return to the municipality. When we look at the benefits, we did deductions for things like risk and contingency, and even things like adoption. Because when you're rolling out some of these programs, not everyone will do it, because this included activity on the private realm. So not everyone is going to build a rain garden. So we actually were conservative in that regard. Even when we made those adjustments, the benefits, the final benefits were greater than the costs, so that we had $1.28 back for every dollar invested. Not a great return for the municipality, but when you look at it from a whole of community point of view, $9 back for every $1 invested. So pretty good return. And from a municipality that's serving a bunch of voters, that's a pretty good case to make, I suggest. The tool also talks about how the benefits minus the costs change over time from a community point of view. The quick wins mean that we're generating net benefits for the community from the outset, and the municipality incurs some significant costs at the start, but over the time, the returns to them start to build until about, what are we looking at? So after a decent return, like a turnaround period of almost 10 years, but they do get the benefit. Again, more information to help us understand what is driving costs, what is driving benefits. And then as we go to from sort of concept and pre-feasibility to feasibility, how do we need to refine our proposals so that we get more benefit and more cost? So it's an iterative process of learning. We had a very good question about how creative are we? Well, sometimes, particularly in cases like this, when we don't have time or budget to go and survey people or do detailed designs, what we do is rely heavily on sensitivity testing. And if an economist turns up with a report and says the number is 10, and they won't tell you what the sensitivity testing is that they've done and how the number changes with different assumptions, send them back to have another go. So for example, in this particular analysis and the tool that we use, it does 1,000 combinations of the different costs and the different benefits, where each cost and each benefit is increased and decreased by a percentage that reflects the risk. We normally do 30%. And in this particular case, it gives us a distribution, a probability distribution. And we can see that the probability of the return to the community being greater than 4 and less than 7 is about 20. But we also can see that there is no probabilities based on the simulations that we ran where it's less than 0. So are there some creative assumptions in this analysis? Absolutely. Do we have enough confidence to say that the benefits are greater than the costs based on what we've done? Yeah, and it's worth some further investigation. We do that for community overall and for the lead organisation, but here we can see that in some simulations, the return to the municipality is less than 1. So we would want to understand which assumptions are driving that outcome for the municipality and prioritise our work with that to give them more confidence that they're at this end of the distribution. Okay, so we're not making a final decision yet. We're actually just trying to use benefit cost analysis to understand what's driving our costs and what's driving our benefits. As Eric said, the last step in the process for us is to think about the distribution of the costs and the benefits. In this particular case, we can see that the municipality is getting, reflecting that 1.29 return. They're getting some benefits, but they're also getting some costs. But there are people here like the department stores that are next to our green plazas, the commuters that are using our green roads that are getting all of the benefit and no direct cost. So when we start to come back to that difficult question of who will pay, we can say to people, well, the right mix of tariffs, taxes and transfers for this particular outcome to fund and finance this outcome can at least be informed by this distribution of costs and benefits. And then I'll just spend 2 minutes doing a quick overview of the tools. The first thing to note is that they're available for you to use and have a look. And just like my colleagues at the Nature Conservancy, we do some training in these sorts of things. Most are free. There's a couple that we just do on a cost recovery basis so that we can keep them current. But if you go to the watersensitivecities.org.au, that'll give you our knowledge portal into the governance, into economics and business cases. And there is a bunch of tools, guidelines and practical examples to have a look at. Or you can go straight down to tools and have a look at the economics tools there. In particular, for those that are interested in benefit cost analysis from a strategic point of view, they don't like spreadsheets and you never want to do one, but you're writing a brief for a consultant to go and do an assessment for you. And you want to understand which questions you want the consultant to answer and how do you make sure you get good value. There's this document at that strategic level, giving you the right questions to ask when you're reviewing an analysis. There's also some tools there. There's one that if you don't have time or budget to do a survey, there is a database of research looking at the whole range of co-benefits from improved health outcomes from reducing urban heat through to cost savings from electricity reductions, or how people value biodiversity in a range of different places. A good first start that can give you information to say, is it worth further investigation? There's 2,000 values there. We're continuing to upgrade and add value to it. And we've done regionally specific versions of this tool. So if you want to know what research is available to help you value co-benefits in a part of Asia, we've got a tool to do that. And we can easily develop other ones. And it's also been used by private sector, government departments, water utilities, NGOs, et cetera, et cetera. So it's widely used in by over 100 organisations. As well as benefits, people are also saying, it was interesting, first of all, people were saying we can't just quantify the co-benefits. And so we developed the benefits tool. Now they're saying we're not confident of the estimates of life cycle cost. So by the end of the year, we'll have a costing tool. And that costing tool will start by saying, let's look at 3 common NBS, permeable pavement, tree pits, bioretention system. What are the cost components of those? So what is the cost of earthworks, filter media, soil sand, connection to the system at construction, maintenance and renewal? And what are the things, and really importantly, what are the things that are driving those costs in different places? So if I'm in a regional centre, how do I have to adjust a cost that might be available for a capital city? Or if I've got a really steep gradient, how do I need to increase the costs or adjust for that? Or it's a really tropical or dry zone, how do I adjust my costs? So the idea is to understand the costs over the asset life for capital and maintenance, but also the drivers of the cost, because we want informed users and really good decision makers and a good understanding of risk. Okay, so they're available to help and we're happy to assist anytime. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Ben. I'll spend 5 minutes going quick recap and some common mistakes, and then we have 20 minutes or so for questions and discussion. So I'll venture again to ask a question. What are your key takeaways from this morning so far, both from this cost-benefit ROI session and the case studies earlier?
Questions regarding the cost benefit. The nature of solutions have many benefits, including the social benefit, the environmental benefit. So how do you transport into your task, the monitoring?
So the question for Zoom is, NBS have many benefits. How do we transfer those into
social benefits,
yeah,
environmental benefits? So how do you transfer this benefit into monitoring in terms of money?
How do we monetize the social benefit? Yeah, sure.
Have a go and then Eric. Yeah. So I think that's a really important question, and it's a start of a long conversation, which we don't have time for today. But the first thing to do is to understand the physical change in the environment. So if we're saying, well, what is the value of increased biodiversity? What are you actually talking about in biophysical terms? And then you can do 2 things. You can look at people's behaviour, or from an economic point of view, you can look at what people do, or you can look at what people say. So, for example, there are ways of measuring the costs that people incur to go and see additional biodiversity and use that as an estimate of the economic value, because that's a reflection of their value. Or you can actually go and use good statistically justifiable means of asking people, how much would you be willing to pay for a particular change? So again, it's basically going and looking at behaviour, revealed preference, and what's the economic value associated with that, or actually asking them to tell you through stated preference.
And that can happen, thanks, Ben, and that can happen before or after the project happens. So that can be in a backwards looking way once something is being delivered, or it can be hypothetically, if there were to be more parks, or if there was to be a new transport system, would you use it? How much would you be willing to pay for that kind of thing? It's also true that it can be challenging to measure the actual ecological benefits, but there are different ways to do that. For instance, in the Cape Town example, what they have is paired catchments where they might in one valley, they clear the invasive plants, in another valley they don't, and then they have flow monitoring stations on the stream. So they're able to have a quantified environmental benefit. Biodiversity monitoring is another example. So you can ask people how much they would be prepared to pay for something, but the other side is how much of that thing is being generated by the project.
Good to differentiate between cost-benefit analysis, return on investment. In our operations, most of us are basically processing our sovereign loan. So the borrower of investment is the government. And then when the borrower cannot achieve a full cost recovery as a result of our investment, for instance, for the water supply, they need to start charging tariff. Then we actually wait to do return on investment analysis. That's how it works in ADB. But we still do economic return on investment, economic analysis. That's what we call it. Then so that's what we do. And then but then nature-based solution, because in many cases that we still need to do a lot with the private sector entity, then I think this net present value ROI kind of analysis is maybe needed. But I think I need to just discuss this with our economists as to what we need to do within ADB. But then we don't really need to justify the return on investment, while we still need to justify through the economic benefit perspectives. So that's what we do. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We have a Ben, and then I think I saw Victor pick up a mic as well. So let's go to Ben first.
Just quickly, when we talk to the private sector about NBS, they say three things. They say the customers do not want it, we don't know how to build it, and it costs too much to build. And I think through the sorts of analysis that we're doing today, we can actually challenge that response with some facts. We can use people's valuations of the benefits and some market research to say, actually, the customers do want it. And in Australia, as part of developing the tools that I talked about, we did that. We've got that evidence showing that people really value these things highly. Secondly, in terms of they don't know how to do it, well, there are lots of guidelines now and lots of case studies to sort of inform that decision. And if it costs too much, that's where we're now starting to say, well, let's look at life cycle costs and how do we build it in the right way so that it reduces the ongoing reduces the ongoing cost. And what sort of risks do we need to build into our analysis so that there are fewer surprises when we get into later in the piece. So I actually think that the information and the process of doing good benefit cost analysis can reveal information that can lead to a better conversation with private sector.
Yes, I was just wondering, in terms of ADB's ROI, if how long is the time span of analysis? And as well as, say, the percentage of expected return. Because if we do the ROI with the NBS, maybe that would be lower than the expected minimum return. Is there such a thing that could kind of hinder or block implementing NBS within ADB projects? Maybe we don't have the answer to that right now.
It may be something we can also explore in the afternoon sessions too.
Well, good morning to everyone. I'm from the human and social development sector, and I'm not very conversant in terms of environment. But I have some few reflections and some insights that I would like to share. Because you talked about the triple bottom line, right? In the end, it's about environment, economic, and then the social benefits. And from us, we work in the social protection sector. We do monitor economic and social benefits. I mean, quite frequently on an annual basis, the impact on the family at the family level and at the individual level. And we also have a lot of different programs, like at the household level, individual, in jobs creation, but also community level. But at the community level, the programs that we have are more small scale infrastructures. And I was very interested in you talking about this, what's this, a broader network that would provide broader value to the community. And I guess it's really more the middle and lower economic classes who benefit from this environmental services. Because for instance, in the Philippines, we don't have that many parks. I mean, even in cities, right? But say we invest in small initiatives that say are located in schools, because schools do have some spaces so where we can explore, innovate, and then learn. But then for the large scale projects, this would require partnerships with large academic institutions who have the technical expertise to monitor long-term outcomes and communicate these benefits to a larger audience that transcends the geographical and then the political boundaries. But we often don't work with a network of academics. It's just partnership with one school or one large university. And there's really no network of academic institutions that would communicate to the public, I mean, what are the intergenerational benefits of these projects? Because when you talked about the time frame, it would take 30 years for us to actually maximize or feel the outcomes that you wanted from the NDS. From the social perspective, we're looking at the projects like annually and then every 5 years. For the government, it's every 6 years or even shorter, like every 3 years. And we think that the schools are very valuable because the schools are the ones who can actually inculcate, you know, what's the value of the environmental services. I mean, I haven't learned what benefits I'm deriving from the environment, and I really haven't learned the value of it until now. That's why it's so hard for me to speak about it. But in some cases, I mean, in some countries, maybe in Japan or in Korea, I guess in Australia, they have a way of communicating it better to the public. And these schools do stay, right? Because when you're urbanizing, people would move out and they're more mobile. But I mean, I think the schools have more in terms, they don't have that much influence in terms of economic, but in terms of decision making and then tying the community together on the different sectors in the community, I think there's really value into that. That's just my insight. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciated those comments and completely agree. And I'll just kind of build on what you were sharing. Yeah, and where I work kind of in on the ground implementation in Philadelphia, we are looking at scaling up implementation with the school district. So they own a lot of land throughout the city. And it's also where, there's opportunities for stormwater management, but it's also creating a lot of these co-benefits for vulnerable populations. So specifically school sites in areas of the city that lack green space. So it's really critical just in terms of access to park, but also thinking about, increased temperatures and reducing urban heat moving forward. Similarly, we have, we work closely with partners looking at housing sites for low-income housing. Again, often areas that lack investment and specifically green spaces. So how are you looking at, the most socially vulnerable populations and ensuring, because that's where you stand to benefit the most from these projects. And that's been shown just, in terms of if we take heat reduction, you're going to have greater outputs in terms of how much you're reducing heat in areas that are less green. So yeah, I just really appreciated those comments. And I think in terms of partners that you can look to, absolutely universities. I think where we're trying to move more, at least in the US, is also getting healthcare institutions involved, because there's been a lot of great research recently coming out about mental and physical health benefits of these projects. So major hospitals are also potential funders for this work. Just recently in the US, there was a study out of Louisville that actually measured, areas of the city where trees had been planted and areas, where there weren't, and actually saw some of those physical health outcomes and lower, heart disease risks. So it's starting to be measured, and I think there's going to be more opportunity for looking at, diverse funding sources too for that.
Great, thanks very much, Lyndon. And to build on that, one of the examples Ben gave before is contingent valuation, which is a survey essentially where you ask people, how much do you value this asset? Now, a community where people have less income will presumably give you lower numbers because they have less money to play with when they're valuing things. But that community might be the one that derives the most health benefit, or maybe where the government's focus in terms of generation of employment is the most important. So Ben touched on this again, where the benefits lie is important, and that should influence the types of analysis that you decide to do, because you can really skew, or your results can be skewed if you design your analysis in a way which is not focused or targeted based on what your stakeholders care about and what you want to achieve.
I'd like to share with my takeaways from the session. So first of all, that projections analysis can be done based on a longer term life span, such as 30 years instead of 10, which was my understanding, so that it will give a better understanding, deeper understanding of the project. And the second, that stakeholders' ownership and support, which was the case of the Cape Town, is very important for the success of the project.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just a quick question. It was very interesting and useful to know different tools that was available to analyze the cost and benefit and return on investment and so on. And I was just wondering, when designing those tools, were there in general other comparative tools in general? Or for example, for EDB, if we want to scale up and do more NBS projects or mainstream NBS component in different type of infrastructure projects, then if we like apply your tools, like for private sector or government type of, projects, is that, we can apply already, and then would you, I was just trying to understand if there's comparative or if we can already, apply yours tools.
Ben doesn't have a mic, so I'll go first. You can absolutely apply the waterproof tool, and there are other TNC tools as well. I'm sure Ben will say the same thing. There's a range of tools that's available. Different tools do exist. Generally, the tools have been, I guess, built to do different things. And the tools that you'll find freely available online are going to be initial kind of pre-feasibility. Should we explore further type of tools rather than a really detailed analysis of the local context? So waterproof might say, we think roughly maybe 3-to-1 cost benefit. And we think maybe these are the types of practices we should do based on some averages and some globally available mapping. But going to the next level further usually does require some kind of targeted analysis using local data and involving those local decision makers, at least so that they're aware of what's going on, so that they then trust the output. So TNC's tools are absolutely available online, and there are other tools available, but these tools aren't the final answer. They kind of give, they indicate whether the door should be opened to more detailed work done at the local scale. But open comments from the rest of the team as well.
Yeah, there are lots of tools out there, and many of them are really good. I guess the key thing is to make sure that when you use the tool, it is not a black box that that it actually helps you understand your costs and benefits and your risks better. So if the tool is transparent about what the assumptions are and helps you understand which are the key assumptions in terms of whether or not you're deciding it's a good or bad project, then it's a good tool. And maybe also too, when you're picking one, look to see who's developed it, and are there good guidelines and case studies to show and videos to support the practical application.
We have a question from Zoom.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the great presentation and discussion. That's very informative. I work with our ADB economists on this issue, trying to integrate economic variation into cost-benefit analysis, project economic analysis. There's a lot of relevant discussion about market value, non-market value. I support the ideas, but I have a little difficulty in terms of non-market value goods and services. I just, in my understanding, in your presentations, in your cases, I didn't really see that non-market value goods and services. That's good, because a market value evaluation it's easier for us to justify, but I just wanted to have your opinion about non-market value goods and services. That's one. Another quick thing is also there's a discussion about what's called a benefit transfer. It doesn't really sound right to me in this discussion with our economists, but I would like to seek your opinions about that too. Thank you.
So non-market value and benefit transfer. So non-market value, we're basically saying there are really important values out there. Like we talk about the value of biodiversity, or we talk about the value of improved health and those sorts of things. Health is a little bit easier, but you can't go and buy a container load of biodiversity. So quite often it's really hard to put an economic value on these sorts of things, particularly if you don't have time or budget to go and do a field survey or go and talk to people directly. So sometimes when we're at the preliminary stage, we say, have there been studies done about similar places that can help us, that we can adapt and then apply as a first screen towards to help us understand, should we do more, should we spend the money to go and do the field survey and to talk to people directly. So value transfer is looking at robust research in one place and adjusting it to see if we can apply in another place. And quite often when you look at the literature, there are studies that have applied market values and non-market values for similar sorts of areas. So quite often at the start, at this sort of preliminary scoping phase, I'll calculate it a couple of different ways, and if calculating the estimate of the value gives you a number that's in the same sort of ballpark, you can be reasonably confident that for the purposes of this preliminary assessment, it's a reasonable proxy. The consequence of not doing this is that you don't include an estimate of the value, and as a result, it has zero value in the analysis.
Thanks, Ben. And on the non-market value point, there are ways, what is the value of a park or what is the value of a beach or clean air? Maybe that's difficult to enact, to put a number on, but we can find things which are maybe proxies or indicators. So what's the value of a park? It might be hard to say, but maybe how does the park influence the real estate value of the buildings around the park? Or how does that influence revenues of the businesses around the park? Or how does it change footfall, and what do those people do and what benefits do they derive based on surveys? So there are different ways that we can assign economic values to the impacts of things which are themselves not market values. On the value transfer point, a different twist. If the question is about transfers between different geographical areas, or maybe areas where nature-based solutions exist versus where the benefits are derived. Government tax and spend is a value transfer if taxes are collected in one place and spent in another place. Or, and there are, for example, the PRC, our project lead there, I think, has gone to the bathroom or something, but they have transfers between different government units where an upstream area perhaps is paid additional tax revenue from a downstream area for some benefits that it provides by restoring nature. So there are different mechanisms for that as well. But maybe that wasn't your question.
Talking about is a what we call payment for ecosystem services, right? Ben answered my question, so that's good. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Well, we're at time, so I think I'm going to add these two questions to the whiteboard, and we can have a solid response to it. But essentially, just for the room, someone online asked for developing countries. Oftentimes, when conducting an economic analysis of nature-based solutions, it's quite good, but the financial ROI is not as strong. So what can we do to strengthen that ROI? And then secondly, what approaches can developing countries take to improve analyses and the outputs in data-poor regions?
Two fantastic questions. We will touch on those in the clinics this afternoon, and then maybe tomorrow morning we can start with those. So incentive for the people on Zoom to show up tomorrow morning as well. Just for completeness, I'll flash some key takeaways and common mistakes on the page. Key takeaways here: benefit costs from ROI are really important. I think we're all agreed on that there. Analysis can be broad or narrow. Are you doing cost benefit analysis or ROI, and what are you looking at and how you're identifying those things? But the things you identify should be chosen intentionally based on your stakeholder mix. So analysis for the sake of analysis often is not worth the investment of time. Input data are key, as touched on by that question Brooke just mentioned. Maybe this is something we can explain later. And point 4, this is a quote, I don't know who it's from. All models are wrong, but some are useful. So inevitably there is some uncertainty in the models we're doing. Ben touched before on scenario analysis. There are very fancy ways of doing that, and there are less fancy ways, but it's always important to incorporate. And some common mistakes, we touched on baseline as well, particularly when we're talking about nature. The example in Cape Town is invasive species. If we don't remove them, they will spread. And that's something we need to incorporate in our baseline when we're saying, should we do this project or not? Involving key stakeholders and building trust. So if you think there's a key decision maker, important to involve them early, even if they're not going to be an active participant, so that when you have done your analysis or your TA team has done the analysis and they present it back, that stakeholder feels like they've been consulted. Lifetime costs has come up a few times in that kind of long-term horizon. And then this long-term program delivery unit. This is a question we had earlier and came up yesterday. How can DFIs support and kind of launch those long-term management programs? And if the DFI isn't going to be involved, which is probably the case, motivating those local organizations to run or continue those programs. And finally, distribution of benefits. We touched on this, so in which strata of the population and which businesses those costs and benefits are arriving to. And I see Brooke taking a photo. You got it? Fantastic. And we've done the questions and discussion. So here we go. I hand do us out.
Thank you.